Welcome, Wargamers, to the putrid gardens of the mortal realms, because today we are talking about the Maggotkin of Nurgle as I'm slowly redoing all of my faction lore videos for 3rd edition. And it is time, much to my excitement, for the Rot Boys to have their treatment. Now, these are the servants of the chaos god Nurgle, a deity who we're going to explore in more detail today and see throughout this series as his forces accept his benevolent gifts and share them so freely with the mortal realms. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or this particular faction, Nurgle is the god of disease, entropy, and most importantly, in my opinion, despair. As long as mortals have suffered melancholy and gloom, Nurgle has existed in some way. But what really kind of gets him revved up and empowered is when mortals have to face that despair and hopelessness for an extended period of time. So, like, for example, if they were to be slowly rotting from a disease, to see their body and their minds undone and the desperation for a cure that follows. So on one hand, we have this deity that absolutely revels in despair, but there's also this element of Nurgle that sees him as a god of life. Your despair at the hands of a flesh-eating disease feeds him. But then again, so does the creation of millions of smaller living entities in the form of bacteria and viruses and maggots and all these kinds of things that are created from your actively rotting corpse. To put this in sort of like a context or hold it up to another character that we know, you think about the goddess of Giran, Alariel, the Ever-Queen, who is the goddess of life magic. I think of Alariel as life maximized, right? Trees grow big and strong, crops yield double their natural amount. Everything that already exists is just invigorated, healed, and magnified. But when you talk about Nurgle being a god of life, personally, I think of it as life minimized, broken down to the lowest possible level. Entropy and rot and ruin break everything down to its most basic form: bacteria, fungal growths, maggots, that kind of stuff. But numerically, there's a far greater abundance of life than with Alariel. Now, that's not expressly stated, there's not really a lore segment that holds the two up in contrast, but that's just generally how I think about it. When we talk about Nurgle rejoicing in life, it usually has to do with when one human dies, a whole cornucopia of life springs from their corpse. So it's, again, one life going away, thousands of lives, albeit much smaller, come about. Even more simply, if you were from any type of fantasy intellectual property to have your generic god of life magic, it's like that, but it's almost like a negative photograph. If you guys have ever seen photography reels when you have the negative, it's technically all the same thing, but it's kind of wrong and it's backwards. But there's so much more going on than just being the deity of sadness and sickness. He is also the god of entropy and the fear of it, and because of that, he sees all time as cyclical, almost as in rotating seasons. Just as all of the maggots and stuff like that he creates have a life cycle, so too does his power. Where his other gods, meaning the other chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, and the Great Horned Rat even, are all constantly to be sort of the king of the hill, who wants to be in charge, Nurgle is not nearly as competitive. He still wants to be on top, but he's not as competitive because he understands that all power waxes and wanes. He has his times where he's on top, and times where others are. Sure, it bums him out when he loses supremacy, but there's a surety and a confidence because all things eventually fall to decay. And so there's this weird confidence of his own supremacy that permeates his part of the great game. And I'm just going to throw this last tidbit in here because I couldn't really find a more interesting place to work it into the lore, but one thing you'll see a lot in his battle tomes in references to 40k and Age of Sigmar is that he has an identity with the number 7 specifically. It's not something that's nearly talked about as much in this book as it was in old Warhammer days, but you're going to see that number show up quite a bit when it comes to his measurements, his ranges, how far his diseases spread, stuff like that. And so when I was trying to unpack, what is Nurgle? Because it's, it's not it's a deity from a different plane of existence. We cannot conceive of his plans. How can I articulate kind of this character for us? And so I decided to break it down into 3 sections: his home, his people, and his mission. Nurgle's home within the realm of chaos is a bit of an odd one, especially compared to his, chaos brothers, if you will. Where the others have fortresses and marching armies, and Khorne has a constant death metal band playing, and Tzeentch has a whole bunch of mirrors that don't reflect anything but, impossibility and all these crazy things, Nurgle's expanse presents itself as a colossal garden. An unimaginable forest of horrors, from trees grown from mortal souls that bear ripened rotting heads, to swamps full of toxic ichor. This is the Garden of Grandpa Nurgle, a living fortress just as impenetrable as any wall, and it's also a reflection of its dark master. Again, it's like a negative of a god of life, right? Think forests, plains, pastures, rivers, ponds, flower fields, all that kind of stuff, which sounds lovely, but it's corrupted, it's rotting, it's constantly in decay, it's festering full of insects and disease and slime. And at the center of this expanse sits a huge house that Nurgle himself calls home. He spends every moment of his day crafting new poxes and plagues and pestilence that he can deliver to the mortal realms through his followers. Now, in his home, in his element, because he can't actually go into the mortal realms himself, he's too big, he presents himself as a colossal, overweight beast with these huge horns, kind of loosely humanoid, a depiction that carries down into his most trusted followers. So if you see a picture of a great unclean one, the model or the artwork, anything like that, think about that, but just magnified 1,000-fold with 1,000 folds of fat, heyo, and you'll get the idea. Now I want to move into talking about his people. Now I just want to put up front, I'm going to have a deeper discussion on both the mortal and demonic followers of Nurgle in this series, but I wanted to really quickly touch on what their motivations are and that kind of stuff. The demons of Nurgle are simply the most straightforward. When he feels the need, Nurgle can break off a small piece of himself and give it form. This is how demons are created by any of the Chaos Gods. The amount of independence and personality and power that they each have is very relevant upon their role. Essentially, what did he design them for? So you have, on the low end, plague bearers and nurglings, which have very little autonomy and creativity. Or on the other end, you have the Great Unclean One, who have the freedom to craft complex missions and lead huge armies. As for the mortal side of things, these are men and women of the realms who have willingly or unwillingly given themselves over to the plague god. We're going to explore their motivations for this devotion in a mortal-specific video. But these collectively, the Rotbringers, see that as their personal mission to blur the line between the mortal realms and the realm of chaos. Every act of desecration is meant to rent reality asunder, and with every success, the vast groves of feculent gnarlmaws and rotting sewage and that kind of stuff creep out of the Garden of Nurgle into reality. They are Nurgle's favored servants and are used to conquer and poison vast swaths of the realms. Now, whether they're mortal or demon, you can almost always smell and see a Nurgle warrior coming. Their bodies are riddled with disease. It seems like they rot in real time. You'll see plagued intestines hanging from exposed, torn out and distended bellies, yet they feel no pain. In fact, they are quite jovial. By accepting the gifts of Nurgle, they free themselves from the agony of disease and are all but invulnerable to the worst possible injuries. Which seems contradictory, right? You're full of disease, but you don't care about it. Well, when people call out and pray to the gods for relief from plagues, Nurgle is all too happy to answer, but it's not so much a cure as a worldview shift. Sure, the disease doesn't bother you anymore, but you become a living vector of it, and like I said, we're going to talk more about them later on. And lastly, I want to talk about his mission. When Age of Sigmar began as a setting, he was most jealously coveting Giran. He wanted the realm of life. He saw this abundance of life and was like, man, if I went in there and corrupted and rotted and ruined all of it, can you imagine how much more life that I would create? And he wanted to turn the entire realm of life into his second Garden of Nurgle. That's kind of his whole jam. However, during the course of the Realmgate Wars, sort of that first campaign chapter of Age of Sigmar, he lost some of his best fighters and the fortresses that really were key positions in maintaining his stranglehold on Giran. He failed to capture Alariel, and now she has been purifying his glorious rot from the realms. And while he was bummed, again, he does not stay sad for very long, because as soon as that happened, he had the realization that he has been so selfish. How could I be this foolish? There are so many other realms to share my gifts with. And so his gaze has sort of not fully left Giran. It's still a strong emphasis there. The Battle Tome has, a great map of Giran and his influence in it, but he's now turning his attention to the wider war, which is really quite impactful to at least the forces of order, but then also his other Chaos brothers. In fact, he has been watching and learning quite a bit. You see, with 3rd edition, sort of the crux, the overarching story is that the forces of order want to expand. They're trying to tame and carve out parts of the realms for themselves. And so to do this, Sigmar has ordered a series of what are called Dawnbringer Crusades. A bunch of mortals leave a city and they try to go colonize something new. Well, what's interesting about these crusades is that they establish cities on places of natural, geomantic power. There's just natural fonts of energy that exist throughout the realms. And so Nurgle's looking at this and he's like, well, wait a minute, the realms are like a living thing and they have these points of natural power. And so he starts to do the same. He sends out his Maggotkin to go to these same points of geomantic power and corrupt them, because essentially he's poisoning the realm itself. And that's something that really wasn't emphasized too much before, is that the realms themselves are a living thing. They respond in real time to the forces that are with them and on them and permeate throughout them. But when you hit these very specific points of power, terrible things can happen. So essentially he will go to an area that has, say, several of these geomantic points, whether they have crusades already building cities on them or not. He'll invade the area and then build these desecration monuments and filth pits and all kinds of bad things. And if you corrupt enough of these points, you can actually create a huge tear in reality where the Garden of Nurgle pours out. Which is an interesting thing, because this is actually the first Chaos book we've had in 3rd edition, and I'm very curious to see how the other Chaos Gods can use these same things. It seems like Order set the tone for what's going on, and everybody else is like, oh man, that's a great idea. And so I want to end this video like I end all of my videos by talking about why I think this is so cool. Again, this is my reintroduction to Nurgle, the Plague God. I absolutely love the themes in this army. This idea of rot, ruin, despair, there's plenty of it all around the mortal realms, and so all of it constantly is feeding Nurgle. When Khorne is, ascendant and he's killing everything and carving up the realm of fire, all those dead bodies eventually rot and feed Nurgle. And one thing I've touched on before that I really do think bears mentioning is that Nurgle is unique amongst the Chaos Gods because his influence outpaces his forces. And when I say that, what I mean is, if Khorne, he sends a Blades of Khorne army, demons and mortals, into an area, they have to go from fortress to fortress and conquer everything that they can. Okay, and that's awesome. It's a lot of combat, a lot of chances to prove and yourself to Khorne and earn skulls for the Skull Throne and all that kind of stuff. But with Nurgle, it's a bit different because he will do the same. He'll send an army to each place, but the diseases that he is sowing into the realms can be carried far faster than any foot-based army. So if he goes to an area and poisons the river, it's not just the army that you have to worry about. Every single civilization and natural forest and all these kinds of things downstream from that are going to be affected, and it's going to be affected faster than his actual army arrives. So when he shows up, people are already sick as all get out. With Khorne, if you kill all the Khorne warriors, they're gone. The army's gone. If you do the same thing for Nurgle's forces, you still have to clean the land. There's still plagues and disease and pus and bacteria and all this kinds of stuff. It's just another level of destruction that none of the other Chaos Gods have in the same way. The idea of this like jovial, loving, paternal grandfather is just awesome. Like, I love that it's a stark contrast to his appearance, and I love the fact that it applies to all of his armies. They have, musicians and parties and carnivals, and half the models have awesome grins. They have multiple bagpipe players, and they're just having a great time. The Nurglings are always laughing and chilling. Like, there's just this weird contrast of, I'm sharing life in abundance and I'm freeing you from the fear of it, but the reality of what that is I'm going to kill you and everyone you love, let you turn into bacteria and larvae and all this kinds of gross stuff. And hey, for those of you who accept my gifts, yeah, you're not going to be afraid of dying of disease anymore, but you're not going to like the way you look. And because of all those things, people wanting to share these great gifts of Nurgle, he puts heroes into very difficult positions, which I think every villain needs to be able to do. Like, to me, a black and white villain of just, curls his mustache because he's evil is not interesting. But having someone who creates situations that our heroes need to deal with in new and unique ways is pretty much, to me, spot on what a great villain is. So what I mean by that is, if a city is infected with plague, and let's say the army hasn't even rolled up yet, right? The Maggotkin aren't even there yet. Multiple stories have been written about Stormcast looking at these mortals and being like, we need to purge this place. And so you can create these situations where the defenders become the terror of the people that they are defending because they are infected. And there's just great stories about how do you contain this disease that is running rampant through the realms? And the kind of dark places that puts our heroes, whether they are mortal or they're Stormcast or whatever, it puts them all in a very awkward position where hard decisions have to be made. And again, I think that makes a great villain. All in all, he creates, awesome bad guy armies that just can't seem to understand, why are we the enemy? We're just coming here to share the beautiful, beneficent gifts of the grandfather. And I like that. Half of them aren't even really warriors. If you read the Black Library books, I feel like half of the Nurgle champions are like, I'm a gardener. I used to have an apple orchard or something like that, and now I'm a Nurgle champion. Because it's not about war, it's about the spread. The spread of plague, the spread of entropy, disease, and despair, and all that kind of stuff. So friends, let me know your thoughts on Papa Nurgle. He is my favorite Chaos God for sure. I like the playstyles of some others as well, but Nurgle takes the cake in terms of the actual lore behind it because there's an amount of complexity and nuance to it that I actually deeply enjoy. And I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave them in the comments down below and I will chat with you later. Thank you so much for watching and happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the filth-ridden war camps of the mortal realms, because today we are talking about the Rotbringers, those mortal forces of the plague god Nurgle, as we continue our exploration of the Maggotkin of Nurgle through their newest battle tome. These guys collectively exemplify the faction in my opinion. They are slow, tough as nails, and they spread disease wherever they go with a merry smile and joy in their sunken, jaundiced eyes. Now, one thing I'd like to add up top, if you like this video and you're interested in this faction, please consider subscribing here on the channel. I have playlists for a whole bunch of different Age of Sigmar lore things, everything from important events in the timeline to covering in-depth factions like this. So if you're not already a member, please join along. We're going to have ourselves a great time. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or the Maggotkin of Nurgle, we began our recent coverage of Nurgle by talking about the Grandfather himself, a being in the realm of chaos that represents both despair, but also the cycle of entropy and decay that often brings things in the mortal world to that despair. And from that video, you, like many people, may be wondering, why on earth would any person want to worship Nurgle? That's fair. You kind of swell up, you get all these terrible diseases inflicted upon you, everyone's all fat and chonky, and why would you ever want that as a life? And so in this video, we're going to aim to answer that question. These are the mortal forces of Nurgle after all. But what makes this kind of hard to answer is that there are actually so many ways that people in the mortal realms end up in the service of Nurgle. And so let's hammer out a few, and we'll talk about the Rotbringers as a whole, regardless of how they got there. Firstly, I want to touch on the fact that mortals can be tortured into submission, and we actually have a great example of this in the lore. We have a champion named Torglug, who we meet in the Realmgate Wars, kind of the first major campaign in Age of Sigmar, who was a champion of Nurgle who basically his whole job was to be the main hunter of Alariel as she and the Stormcast Eternals who were trying to save her did a merry chase across Giran. Well, Torglug began as a mortal who fought against the Nurgle forces back in the Age of Chaos, but he was captured, tortured, thrown into what's called a filth pit, which is essentially like a desecration site for Nurgle forces. Kind of think of it as like a torture chamber where the body is assailed by all kinds of horrific diseases and mutations all at once, and so after an extended period of time, this hero's will was sapped and he finally submitted, coming out of the pit as a follower of Nurgle. And we can look at that and be like, okay, that makes sense that they had to break him body, mind, and spirit, but why would somebody choose this, right? Not about being forced into submission or coerced, but choose it willingly. Well, Nurgle first entered the realm of Giran not with an army, but with blessings. People in the mortal realms, even before the Age of Chaos, had enemies and dangers and natural disasters to contend with. For example, drought can be potentially devastating in many isolated communities, and that happens all the time regardless of any chaos forces. And so when farmers pray for rain, who should be so happy but to grant them that gift other than Nurgle? Sure, the rain's a little weird, kinda yellow, but hey, whatever, stuff's growing, we're taking what we can get. In fact, there's multiple occasions where Nurgle simply answers people's prayers, something that the good gods in the Pantheon failed to do. And once a community has received his blessings, things ramp up very, very fast, and it gives Nurgle a foothold. All of a sudden, the town can slowly be corrupted, and I say slowly kind of in quotes, but it can happen pretty quickly as well. Now, another common example is escape from disease itself. Let's say you contract a deadly flesh-eating disease up your leg, right? The odds are not looking good. You've been to healers and priests and all these kinds of things, and you might call out to the gods for salvation, and one voice answers. And it simply says, "Serve me, and I'll take away the pain of your ailment." And so, obviously, yeah, absolutely, that's what I want. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you bind yourself to the service of Nurgle. Now, be mindful about what that promise was. I'll take away the pain of your ailment. The pain goes away, but not the disease. And you continue to rot and be sick, but all of a sudden, you don't mind it. Again, you feel blessed and blissful. Not to mention, you could have just been raised in one of the thousands upon thousands of chaos tribes that revere some partial or imperfect version of Nurgle, like the god of rain, the cycle of life. There's all kinds of other names for him besides Nurgle, where people worship these, quote unquote old gods without actually knowing the deity that they're serving. And so you're just kind of raised with a belief in him. My point is, there's a myriad of ways to end up as a Rotbringer. None of them are particularly nice, but they are many different avenues, and the grandfather always has a seat at his table available for you. Regardless of how you got there, there's much more going on here than just a bunch of sick people looking for a fight. Because they really, whenever you do make that turn of, being a mortal who chooses Nurgle, you really do have a mental and spiritual shift as well. To the Rotbringers, entropy, decay, and disease are not only, not bad, but they're active blessings. All things die, all things fail. But instead of fighting against it, you can rejoice in the limited time that you have. Share your limited time in these realms, freeing others from the pain of their mortal coil. Inflict disease upon others so that they may see their own finality and call out to the grandfather as well. In this worldview shift, every virus, disease, or pox becomes a personal invitation to join Nurgle. He is a gracious and benevolent god, and like I said, there's always a seat open at his table, and he's happy to take away the pain of your finite existence. Again, it's feeding into that despair. He's looking to bring the mortal realms to a point where they cherish his greatness, to be free from the ravages of entropy by being the ones who deliver it. Of course, this means that the Rotbringers can have a highly positive outlook despite looking truly horrific and disgusting, and so that's the mindset and a few possible origins. But even within that, there's a huge spectrum of personalities that can be created. And actually, one resource that I want to point people towards is an old series that came out during the Realmgate Wars. It's called Call of Archaon. It was a series of short books that came out, I believe it was for a Christmas bundle. And one of those books kind of follows the tale of this Nurgle warband. Essentially, one of the heroes in that warband has been summoned by a Gaunt Summoner, as he's a champion that might just be the guy that Archaon wants to join as a Varangard. And it's all about his, trials and tribulations as he tries to achieve this. So I'm not going to give any spoilers, but what I will say is it's a great resource because you do get a sense of what different personality types are. Some are much more martial-minded. Oh yeah, we need to be out conquering. Why? Because that's what Chaos Warbands do, cue metal riff. Whereas some other characters are like, no, we can go slow. Why? Because the grandfather is not in a rush. It's about spreading the garden. It's about growing influence, corrupting things over time and entropy. There is no rush, because time means nothing to him. And so you get to see different perspectives and worldviews and personalities. Some are much more jovial, some are much more serious, and there's this whole spectrum within there. Now, I want to end this video talking about why I think these guys are cool. And to be perfectly honest, I have mentioned this before in other videos, I love Mortal Nurgle stuff, because more so than any other Chaos faction, I think they are an interesting mirror of human emotions, or I should say rather a mockery of it. Sure, rage, indulgence, and secrets are equally understandable actions and emotions, that being from Khorne and Slaanesh and Tzeentch respectively, but there's just something about this kind of hopelessness and kind of the gaze that you get when you stare into the void and think about your own finality, with the desperation that follows, that is so uniquely human. And I mean, of course, when I say human, I mean for us, the reader, not within the setting. This stuff affects elves and dwarves and all that kind of stuff too. How many of us are in pain and would do anything for a release from it? How many are swallowed by sadness at our own finite nature and want purpose more than anything? A task to do, a pain relieved, and a freedom that we can then go and share with others and kind of be the hero of the story. I reckon a whole lot of us. But of course, all those things are great and deeply part of the human experience, but when you twist and pervert it into a weapon, it becomes something that is truly scary. It goes from trying to talk to people out of a false hope, meaning I don't want you to believe in, Sigmar, the Sigmarite church, because they're lying to you, which largely they probably are, into destroying it. I am going to take your hope in that church away by annihilating it. Again, it's weaponizing. I don't want you to have this false hope, but the twist is when it becomes militant and angry and corruptive and aggressive. I'm going to take it from you. And the whole goal is to put others into positions where they themselves are desperate and scared and need to call out to anything that will listen to salvation. And that salvation, meaning Nurgle's blessings, is just as false of a hope as whatever the heck they ripped away from you in the first place. It's all super messed up. But in this way, we see a whole bunch of characters, taken to an extreme, like a cartoonish extreme, of dealing with these concepts of hopelessness and despair. Seeking anything from a refuge from either how small they are, individually, they just have no impact or no meaning, they're looking for something to value them, and of course Nurgle always does, to conquering warlords who just want power. And of course, as a chaos deity, Nurgle's happy to provide. He's happy to infuse champions with his power, and he can go out and have, huge conquesting armies and all that kind of stuff. Now, one thing I do want to end the video by talking about is that Nurgle doesn't look at champions the same way as the other chaos gods. So Tzeentch or Khorne, or even Slaanesh to an extent, they can look at their followers, at least the mortal side, and be like, okay, you are good, at least a good servant, because of the amount of pain and devastation and corruption or whatever, insert whatever they like to do on the mortal realms. But Nurgle's a bit different because when he evaluates his followers, it's not necessarily about conquering. It's not about war. It's about how have you grown the garden? How many people have you brought into the fold? Like, it's much more like laid back in a sense of just the garden will grow because it's disease. It just runs rampant. It spreads like wildfire. And so if you tend the garden well and his blight kind of crosses the entire realm, you will do better as a person who does that and never lifts an axe than a conquering warlord who destroys fortresses. And so that's a little bit of a different thing, and I appreciate that because, again, it's just more ways to look at all these different characters. With that all being said, I want to hear your guys' thoughts. What do you like about the Rotbringers? Now, I was going to go into unit by unit kind of a thing, but the truth is there's not a lot of lore for each of these units, and I already did my older videos that cover them. Nothing's changed. I just kind of wanted to refresh about the mortal forces. The truth is, you turn into a Blight King, and then you can, if you want to, take a trial to gain a fly that you ride on, or go down several of the paths and become a champion and march on your own path to glory. So I didn't feel like there was a whole lot of substance there for dedicated videos like unit by unit. That being said, I love these guys a whole lot, and I'm excited to get back to building mine. Tell me your favorite unit and why. Leave it in the comments down below and I will catch you there. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and please subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the putrid gardens in the realm of chaos, because today we are talking about the Nurgle demons, those entities that tear into reality from the Garden of Nurgle to defile, corrupt, and annihilate any kind of hope. Now, one thing I'd like to add right up top, if you are new to the channel or just this video, please consider clicking the subscribe button. We have a whole bunch of great videos here concerning Age of Sigmar lore and various other games, including Conquest and Infinity here and there, that kind of stuff, with a really awesome community in the comments. And so if you'd like to be a part of that, please hit subscribe so that you get notified about future videos, and it goes a long way to helping me with like metrics and YouTube and all that kind of jazz on the outside. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or the faction Maggotkin of Nurgle, today we're really focusing on the demon aspect of it. It's kind of one of the whole groups of models within this book. Demons are an interesting thing in the Games Workshop intellectual property, because essentially they are each a bit of the Chaos Gods, Nurgle, Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, and the Great Horn Rat for that matter. Essentially, those characters are so massive in power and stature that they can break off small bits of themselves and craft it into an entity all its own. And that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about today. When you go to play the Maggotkin of Nurgle book, there are forces that are marked as mortal, meaning they are humans that were changed, and then there's demonic. So we're going to have forces straight out of hell, but they fully represent all the things that their patron god, in this case Nurgle, is. And so the way we're going to structure this is basically talking about demons in general, how they function in this kind of setting, and what Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and thereby extension to a lesser extent 40k, demons are like. And then we'll move on to more talking about the specific Nurgle-centric ones. So, Nurgle himself has broken off an infinitely small piece of his own nature. This is known as a demon. He is a direct representative and warrior of his patron god, a copy of at least their nature. Certainly not their size or their strength, nothing like that. No one's as big as Nurgle. He's not, self-dividing like a cell or anything like that. But it's important to know that they are a piece of their deity simply because demons can't change sides, but they do not have autonomy in the same way that you or I do. They're literally a piece of a larger entity, and this allows Chaos Gods to spread their influence far and wide. Within the realm of chaos, there are vast armies of demons in constant warfare as the borders between the gods ebb and flow. Let's say, for example, Khorne becomes ascendant, right? He becomes kind of the most powerful character amongst the Chaos Gods in this great game that they play. Well, that influx of energy into him will allow him to create more demons, and so he will then have more forces to push the borders of his brothers back. When Khorne goes down in stock and Nurgle rises, again, we're talking about him today, more plague bearers and all these gross, nasty things, the borders of the Garden of Nurgle expand, and all of a sudden these demons are sweeping over their neighbors. But they can also act as the gods' foot soldiers in the material world. But getting them there is a bit of a hassle. You see, demons within the realm of chaos make perfect sense, but they are incredibly unnatural in the mortal realms. They simply don't belong there. However, if enough destruction or chaos is done in a tight enough area, a veil can be torn between the two worlds, and demons will begin to spill out. The smaller the demon, the easier it is for them to get through. The larger ones are going to require more ritual, more sacrifice, more desecration, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, on the far end, there's a point where stuff just cannot come through. Like, for example, Nurgle himself, no matter how big a terror is, can't just walk into the mortal realms because he's just too big. He's too much immaterial to be able to fit into reality. When demons are struck down in the mortal realms, instead of leaving a corpse, they dissipate and go back to the realm of chaos, ready to be reformed once more by their masters. But that's demons like in general, right? Let's talk about Nurgle demons. Nurgle, as we've explored this week, is the god of disease and entropy and despair, and we looked at his mortal followers already. Oftentimes, the goals of those mortal followers is, honestly, to tear open rents in reality so that the Garden of Nurgle and his demons can pour into the mortal realms. This typically starts with the lowly Plague Bearer. And there's a whole bunch of units that are kind of like on the same peg of the totem pole, if you will, in terms of they're just kind of nobodies, so bear with me. It's not like the Plague Bearer is the actual bottom. But a Plague Bearer is a largely mindless humanoid, terribly deformed by disease and pustules, that just kind of saunter around the Garden of Nurgle. These are people, like basically their souls, who have died from the disease known as Nurgle's rot and are damned to an eternity of servitude sustained only by the will of Nurgle himself. They are demons, but basically imagine if you put the soul of someone in there just as a constant torture. Now, of course, this service can be done on foot with huge hordes of slow, droning, plague bearers, and they really do move like zombies. They're described pretty frequently, like especially in the early Rumgate War books, they just move super slow, but they don't stop coming, and they're very hard to take out. And they can do that on foot, or they can do it on the top of a rotfly, which is when you get the Plague Bearer cavalry unit. Now, it's important to note that the lesser the demon, meaning the lower you are on the rung, the lower your intelligence and individuality. So Plague Bearers have no autonomy. They can't really think a whole lot for themselves, and they kind of act like stereotypical 80s movie zombies, just totally mindless. Right next to them, or I should say skittering between their feet, are Nurglings, and they're not so much individual entities as they are these little sprites, almost like little goblins that just kind of come up and annoy and entertain and get into all kinds of mischief. They are a reflection of the dark humor that Nurgle exudes, and again, almost no autonomy. They don't really think. They're almost like toddlers who are just demon infused. And another one on the kind of lower intelligence rung is the Beasts of Nurgle. And these guys are the best. These are the goodest boys in all of the mortal realms. Because if you look at them, they present as these gross, large slug monsters. I've got all kinds of spores and tentacles all over them. They're dripping with nasty decay and ooze. But they have the minds of excited puppy dogs. And I mean actual puppy dog. They just are really happy to get in and play with people. They want to roll around and have fun and wrestle and all the things that dogs like to do. They charge at the enemy not to destroy, but to play. And I kind of view them as being off to the side of a hierarchy because they're not really designed to have a mind or a personality. They really are meant to be like animals, at least a corrupt form of it. But at this point, we could start talking about demons with brains, right? Everything from here on out is at least smart enough to be given a task and execute it independently. And that all starts with the Heralds of Nurgle. Think of these as plague bearers that have been elevated, imbued with more power and personality to be able to direct their lesser kin. And these come in 3 varieties. The Poxbringer, which is essentially a plague bearer that went Super Saiyan, and now he is also a wizard. So these are going to be your more intelligent, more arcane kind of minded types. There's the Sloppity Bile Piper, which the Sloppity Bile Piper is actually a very cursed being. It's a plague bearer that received a curse where it starts to dance and laugh and have fun. He rips out the stomach of the last Sloppity Bile Piper, the one who passed the curse to him, and he is it's like a disease for Nurgle units specifically plague bearers actually. And he just kind of gets this jaunty dance and he starts entertaining, and he just goes until he dies, in which case the nearest plague bearer picks up his guts, turns it into a bagpipe, and starts playing and doing the exact same thing. So he's kind of like a leader, he's like a rallying point, entertainer, all these kinds of things. And the last one is the Spoilpox Scrivener. And so one of the things that's not really touched on too much in the kind of intro lore is that not only does Nurgle like to create diseases, but he likes to record them as well. Things naturally evolve and interact in the wildlife, and so essentially he has the Spoilpox Scriveners going out with huge hordes of plague bearers to count all the various diseases of the realms, and he is the accountant, and I guess you could say, in that respect. Now, the named characters, I think, really deserve their own dedicated video, so I'm going to go ahead and really focus on those elsewhere. But the last big guy we have to mention are the Great Unclean Ones. And I love the Great Unclean Ones so much. Not so much because of like the literal model. I mean, I do like the model, to be honest with you. It's pretty impressive. But the reason I find Great Unclean Ones to be so interesting is the way that they're described. We actually know a lot about them simply from the Realmgate Wars, where that initial story setting in Age of Sigmar, that first year it was out, it was kind of the campaign arc for that time. And we saw a particular Great Unclean One named Bolithrax, who was constantly fighting Gardas Steelsoul, a Lord Celestin of the Hallowed Knights. And the way that those books were written, those very, very early ones, was so interesting because it wasn't so much talking about the sheer size, which of course, if you look at a Great Unclean One, it's the most obvious thing that you see, but how they move. That they're too fast for their size. Like, even just their motions seem unnatural, given the physics of the universe. Whenever they are in a scene, they dominate it. I mean, just like their force of personality, the tone, the way that they speak to one another. It's just scene stealing in the best way possible. They are the scariest of demons, and they come in all kinds of sizes and shapes as well. Of course, we know that they're all pretty big. I mean, Bolithrax was so fat that he ran through a realm gate and broke it. But on the other end of that spectrum, like, let's consider him we're going to call him a tiny guy. He's the tater tot. We're going to talk about the actual big one, which, if you haven't read the Realmgate Wars, this is just going to sound out of left field and completely random. But there was a Great Unclean One that was so huge that his whole job was to just go sit in a river in Giran and poop. Like, that's all he did. That was his full-time job. Sit here, crap in the river. And he did. And so he would contaminate everything going downstream from it. But to give you a sense of scale, that's how large this thing was, where it's just like, sit in a river, just poop. Boom, you're contributing to the war effort. What a champion. And so I wanted to end this video like I end all of mine by talking about why I like this so much. And, demons can be a tough one for me personally because they are intentionally, I will say, rather one-dimensional. Right, that dimension is whatever their god is like. Nurgle likes diseases and despairs. Take a wild guess as to what these guys are super into. But that being said, that's the point, and that's kind of, to me, is where it gets a pass for being not really boring, but that's the only word that comes to mind, because it is a copy paste of a singular will. And while that can make them a bit boring narratively, it also makes them terrifying. And keep in mind, when I say they're boring or mindless, I'm only talking about the lowest tier, right? Like, Heralds of Nurgle and up show an immense amount of personality. One of the best books to get that sense, if you're interested, is actually Nagash Undying King. There's a whole force of Blight Kings, but then there's also a Herald of Nurgle joining them, and you see an immense amount of personality from that character. I won't say any more to spoil it for you. I really enjoyed that book. As always, Great Unclean Ones, as I said before, are always scene stealers, and there have been a bunch of really cool Herald-level characters as well. Some focus on Nurgle's, perversion of joy, so they seem kind of giddy and frantic and playful, and others can reflect his dour hopelessness and seem kind of grim and, I guess, sort of what you might expect from a god of despair. Some have these colossal war plans. Some just want to be gardeners and get left alone, like Horticulus Slimax. He's a named character. He's going to have his own video, but he's just kind of cranky, and he just wants to keep planting seeds and have a garden. So I guess what I'm really trying to get at is that even though on the surface, talking about demons can make them seem one-dimensional, when you get into the leadership, character abounds for these guys, and it makes them insanely interesting. So friends, tell me, what is your favorite demon of Nurgle? I would love to know. For me, It's my boy Bolithrax, the one who was initially fighting Guard of Steel Soul, chased him all through the Garden of Nurgle in the Rumgate Wars. It was just a terror, and I absolutely loved that story. Let me know in the comments down below which is your favorite, and I will respond to you there. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming! Welcome, Wargamers, to the fetid swamps of the Mortal Realms, because today we are talking about a sub-faction of Nurgle that people are super excited about, even though you can't actually play it in the game, which is super funny. And I speak, of course, about the Order of the Fly. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar, or perhaps Maggotkin of Nurgle as a faction, you may not have heard of these guys because they don't actually show up as a playable, I guess, quote-unquote, faction within the game. Normally, you have your army, Maggotkin of Nurgle, and below that are several sub-factions. So you have like the Blessed Sons and all those kinds of things. Well, our subject today exists only in a lore sense. There's no rules to play them to my knowledge. And yet, they are one of the most compelling sub-factions of the Maggotkin of Nurgle ever put to paper. Now, for the longest time, this faction actually didn't exist in the Maggotkin of Nurgle book. Like, the Nurgle book came out, and then they started writing about the Order of the Fly either during that production or afterwards. And so now when we got this new battle tome, now there's actually a story that includes them, even though they've existed in Black Library publications for some time. And so I wanted to read that one for us today. It's actually on page 17 of the Nurgle battle tome here, and it's called Defiled Chivalry. In the so-called Blighted Duchies of Giran, the Order of the Fly raises its filth-encrusted banners. These knights have long since pledged themselves to Nurgle, honoring a being they know as the Lady of Cankerwall, and setting out on as many gruesome quests to spread sickness and misery across the Jade Kingdoms. Yet their demented ambitions reach beyond Giran's borders. Blightmaster Walgus, one of the prime commanders of the Order, musters a vast host of mortals and demons to march on Shyish. Walgus's army drives hundreds of death-worshipping mortal tribes before them, the survivors forced either to pledge themselves to Nurgle or meet with a most gruesome demise. Though Walgus is eventually slain in the presence of Nagash himself and the crusade shattered, the Order endures, and serves as a grim inspiration for many other Rotbringers to begin establishing their own noxious fiefs. So put very, very simply, the Order of the Fly is a very, very large Nurgle warband, for lack of a better term. It's a whole army. It's like a whole complex, and they have multiple crusades. Like, think of it as like a City of Sigmar kind of a thing, but it's a huge Nurgle army that started off as being a very chivalrous, I guess my mind kind of goes to like Arthurian legend kind of Order faction. Everything's knightly, and there's squires, and there's nobility, and household rights, and all these kinds of things. And then Nurgle sweeps in. Now, we don't exactly know how he got, I guess infected, we could say, this society was. It seems like it all comes down to their leader, Lady of Cankerwall. Cankerwall being a place, if I'm not mistaken. It's like a fortress or fortification, and she is the bearer of an artifact known as the Fly-Blown Chalice, which essentially acts as the iconography of the Order of the Fly. They have chalices on just about everything, or kind of intermingled with Nurgle symbols, that kind of stuff. Now, one thing to note is that there are a lot of mentions in multiple of the stories where these guys appear, where it's mortals and demons working together. And that actually makes for some of the most compelling storytelling, I think. It gives you the best perspective of what demons are like, especially when you can, in real time, contrast them with mortals as they're having a conversation. So we're going to touch on some of the books that these guys are in, but just as a heads up, like, I love these guys in the stories. So what sets the Order of the Fly apart from, tons of other Nurgle warbands, right? Because we've seen Black Library stories of champions of Nurgle who have massive, almost continent-spanning wide armies at their disposal, and all these crazy, levels and proportions of things. What makes these guys so special? Well, for one, they're orderly, and that obviously, I know that sounds a little ridiculous given their name, Order of the Fly, but what I mean is, a lot of Chaos warbands just kind of meander around, just going from place to place, conquering in the name of their deity. But what we see with the Order of the Fly is that they have a central location, Cankerwall. They have a core hierarchy that is not based on martial leadership, meaning the Lady of Cankerwall, she's like a seer, a prophetess. She channels the will of Nurgle and all these kinds of things, but she is not like at the front of the lines fighting. This is not a might makes right type thing. There's allegiances that they all have to pledge to one another. They share a common, I guess, mythos with the whole idea of the chalice and that kind of thing. Like, they just are unified in their belief structure, and they have a support system, because one thing that people often forget when they talk about historical campaigns and things like that, I'm just a history buff, I'm going to rant here for a second, is how much work it takes not only to have a crusade, but to keep it going, but to supply it, right? So when you talk about these massive, massive campaigns, like he did this one in Tishai-ish, it required having a support structure behind it. Cankerwall exists, the lady, I'm assuming either sent him out or gave him some form of blessing. But once they started moving, that army needed food, it needed places to sleep, it needed all these kinds of things, and they just kept going and going and going. And so when I say that they are orderly, I mean that they have these support and societal structures in place to make crusades truly devastating, right? Instead of just a roving band of murderers, which is kind of what a lot of Khorne warbands are alluded to, this is something very, very different. This is a kingdom going to war. And certainly one of the defining aspects of their personality, I guess you could say, collectively, is this idea of clarity. And I'm going to use clarity there with a capital C. We see it a few times come up in dialogue through various Black Library books, and it's this idea that in their perception, Nurgle has, opened their eyes to the truths of the world, that everything that they were striving for and fighting for is going to melt away into entropy, and we need to help other people see that. And so if everyone just shared our perspective, everything would be great, which is, I guess, technically true, but it also is never going to happen. And so that's what they're doing. They see themselves as going out and fighting the ignorant and the savages of the realms, trying to enlighten them that they should not be fighting against the inevitable doom that's coming, but rather just embrace it, which is what they're doing. We had discussed before in previous Nurgle videos how that deity specifically, I think more so than any other, warps your perception. In stark contrast to something like Khorne, where a Khorne warlord will see, maybe like an opposing enemy as a challenge to overcome, right? I'm going to offer that skull to Khorne. His perception isn't different. He just does the quick, warlord math of, hey, that's a big skull, I want to put that on my pyramid. But with Nurgle, it is an entire perception shift. That things were gross and nasty and fugly before now become beautiful and harmonious and serene. And so just as certain, monastic knightly orders that we had in our own history are part like warrior, part priest, these guys can be similar in that sense. They see themselves as going out questing, trying to bring enlightenment to the people around them. Of course, that enlightenment comes at the edge of a sword and a whole bunch of nasty Nurgle stuff behind it, but it's how they perceive it nonetheless. Now, normally at this point I would say, there's a lot more going on than just being a Nurgle sub-faction with a sort of knightly, filter on it. But the truth is, there's no way to meaningfully interact with these guys on the tabletop. There's no rules for them. And so instead, what I wanted to do with this section is just talk about some of their achievements, and then we're going to have a discussion on where you can learn more about them, because there are some really cool stories about the Order of the Fly. So as far as their achievements, they are a Chaos Warband that at one point held one of the 8 Lamentations. These are a set of 8 incredibly powerful artifacts. We're talking deity level weapons that exist in the realms. There's actually been a few books written about the various characters of Order trying to reclaim these things. 8 Lamentations, the Spear of Shadows. I think another one is mentioned in the Tainted Axe short story, where we get some of this. But yeah, there's just these mythic level things. The fact that they were able to have one, at least at one point, shows they're out actively doing things. They're scraping across the realms, they're doing everything, they're spreading, they're collecting important artifacts and weapons and bringing them back home to the lady. They launched what they call several Pox Crusades, which are essentially just, their knightly orders going out and trying to bring the good news of Nurgle everywhere they can. And the Necroquake has not really taken any of those territories away from them, which is incredible. I mean, because quite frankly, when the Necroquake happened, there's tons of stories of chaos and order bastions all falling apart because they just got swamped by spirits and undead and all these kinds of things. The fact that they didn't lose any land is quite incredible. They participate frequently in tournaments and jousts and fights at the Varenspire because they are so big and so colossal and so renowned. They constantly get invites from Archaon, or I suppose it's more the Gaunt Summoners, to bring their warriors in to try and prove themselves worthy of becoming a Varengard. And I guess I get the sense that Archaon puts on multiple events and tournaments for these kinds of things, because secondary to that, there was another one called the Black Tourney that was held in the All Points, not necessarily the Varenspire, but basically it's just a whole bunch of Chaos Knights going at each other, just trying to assert dominance over one another. Now, as far as a faction, like how it presents itself, they are a bit unique in one aspect, and that is in the Maggotkin of Nurgle battle tome, it seems as though all the factions either lean demon or mortal. Like, there's 3 for each. Whereas the Order of the Fly is unique in that they bring both. They are constantly shown as having plague bearers and heralds of Nurgle, so the demons, working with and talking directly to the mortal elements of their faction, which typically ride around on tainted steeds. I think they're described as in the books. We would probably just use the Pusco Blightlords, and they can have, Rotbringers walking alongside of them, acting as their squires and armsmen. They're shown as having a whole lot of toad dragon hides on them, so they like to decorate and adorn their armor. And they have this great little line where each of these heroes must quest for and taste the sour syrup of the fly-blown chalice from the Lady of Cankerwall, and only then may they take the 7 times 77 oaths to the King of the All Flies, and that's how they become a part of this, again, knightly order. We know that their original base is in Giran, so they kind of come out of that area. Now, where that is specifically on a map is a bit ambiguous, but there are stories that show their fortress being assaulted by various armies, and it's just massive in its magnitude. So real quick before we get to why I think these guys are so cool and so important, I just want to kind of rattle off some of the places you can read about them. The best source that there is the book Nagash, Undying King, which I think is available in a ton of different formats. I know there's an Audible version, there's obviously the written stuff. It's a great story about the Order of the Fly invading Shyish. It's a complete story, it's a novel, I love it. I'll talk more about it here in a second, but there's also a few short stories. They're included in the Tainted Axe short story. There was a book, I think it's called Legends of the Age of Sigmar, and it has a Sylvaneth on the cover. There's 2 stories in there that involve them, the Resolute and the Outcast. The Outcast is one where I believe that's where they have the Lamentation, that super artifact that they wanted to use against the Sylvaneth. They also make a quick appearance, I believe, in Plague Garden, or at least mentioned there, and have had little tiny entries in things like Scourge of Fate and or Battletome Slaves to Darkness. Just like the little stories that they have there, little 1-paragraph things, and now, of course, within the Maggotkin of Nurgle Battletome itself. And so we've talked about what they are. Essentially, it's a Nurgle warband that's very chivalrous. So why is that so cool? Why do people love these guys so much? I think it boils down to Nagash, Undying King. At least it does for me. That is the first book that I ever saw them in. I can't remember if the short stories came out before then. Maybe Scourge of Fate did, but Nagash, Undying King was it was a fire story where this warband of Nurgle enters in on, again, one of their Pox crusades. And I won't spoil anything for you because I really do want you to read it, but it essentially details a mortal champion working alongside a demon champion. So for the sake of a discussion, let's say it's like a Lord of Blights hanging out with a Herald of Nurgle, and the two have to work together, but they have such different personalities and perspectives. It's actually a book I recommend the most when it comes to trying to understand the differences, or I guess the personality behind demons. Because when you see them contrasted with a mortal and how they speak about things, it makes for some very compelling stuff. And you get to see what a Nurgle warband traveling through Shyish, or what they think of the landscape, and they get attacked by all kinds of crazy monsters and stuff. It's the coolest thing. Highly recommend you read it. But I think really when it comes to the Order of the Fly, the thing that people are really attracted to, I think, is twofold. One is contrast, meaning, that when you look at them, they're filthy and gross and everything's covered in grime, but their perception of the world is that everything is gleaming and shiny. Not in the Flesh Eater Court's way of literal warped perception in that, rather like a delusion, but instead they see this as like, everything's a mission from God. They're going out to try and change the land. They have these noble qualities. And even in one of the short stories, their enemy remarks on, it's like a faction of Order is like, man, they just really are people of conviction, which is like a hard thing to have to gotta give it to them. They have a great sense of honor. It's just a weird thing when you're talking about such an evil warband going around and destroying things. So it's this mix of there is something deeply respectable about them, but it's also shrouded in horror, like just straight up unimaginable horror. And I think that the second reason really why they capture so many people's minds is there's so many nods to Bretonnia in this. Got the Lady of Cankerwall. They're all yelling for the lady. They got chalices on there, all their war banners and that kind of stuff. There's just a lot of sort of not references in the sense of Games Workshop wants you to think that this is what Bretonnia has become kind of a deal, but more like nods to that trope, that classic Arthurian legend kind of thing. And that's super cool because that's a kind of fantasy that so many people are into, not me particularly, but in general, absolutely. Everything that you do from a game perspective can fit into their lore for a Pox Crusade or something like that. And you have this cool built-in belief system. You have plenty of stories to reference if you're curious about that. In terms of number of Black Library publications, these actually have I think 9 or something like that, where they're just kind of mentioned. I mean, the biggest one, of course, is Nagash Undying King, but even within that, you can parse their dialogue and come up with a pretty elaborate backstory for them. They're pretty cool. And it's that little edge of playing a faction or loving a faction that just doesn't have any rules. And to me, that is peak Warhammer, right? When you read something and you're like, that is so flippin' awesome. I want to bring that to the tabletop. And even though there's no way to do that, as far as Games Workshop publications go, the fact that so many people want to is testament to how cool the idea is. Nurgle, but it's not just roving madmen. It's not just people who want to defile and all these kinds of things. It's a seer, so the Lady of Cankerwall herself, creating this illusion of knighthood and honor and oaths and all these kinds of things that we love. I mean, there's so many classic fantasy things there that are there to love, and then just filtering it through a horrific lens. And I think that is one of the coolest things that Games Workshop is really, really good at doing, is just taking a concept that already exists. They didn't invent knightly legends and that kind of stuff, but when you put it through the scope of Nurgle, it just takes on a life of its own. And I love that kind of stuff. I do hope at some point there is some kind of supplement or something like that comes out with rules for them. I would love to see Order of the Fly armies on the tabletop, especially with how great Nurgle is right now in terms of, being so defensive rather than speedy and offensive. I think that it lends itself to the kind of stalwart, we never back up or lose ground story that I think these knights would in their minds be trying to put forward. And so I think what I'm saying is the Battle Tome is at a place where it's very conducive to the Order of the Fly storytelling. I don't really know what they would need to be unique in terms of playstyle. Maybe something to do with how they bring demons in. I don't know. Because again, one of the defining features of them is that they have demons constantly mingled in with their mortals. So maybe there's some synergy or keyword gaps that we can make that would be kind of cool to bridge those two together. Or heck, I mean, if they really wanted to expand it and make it something wholly unique, just grab one of the, what are they called? Maggoth riders and put them in charge. Blow a Rotbond, or there's one of those characters that ride the Maggoth things, and put those in charge of the Order of the Fly, or have them act as an auxiliary thing. Just kind of tie the Order of the Fly into the main Nurgle things here at some point. I'd love to see it. But anyway, friends, that's all I have to say on the Order of the Fly. They are very cool. Go check out Nagash Undying King, and I listed off some other stuff there for you. Figure out why these guys are so cool. I promise you, once you read that book, you're going to fall in love with them. Let me know your thoughts on the Order of the Fly down below. If you have a developed backstory for the Lady of Cankerwall, or why you think her motivations are so dubious, and maybe even how they fell into the arms of Nurgle, I would love to read about it, so throw it in the comments down below. I will respond to you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the fetid, nasty parts of Giran, because today we are going to be covering a bit of lore that's in the Maggotkin of Nurgle battle tome that might just be setting the stage for the next great conflict within the mortal realms. I speak, of course, from page 19, the story The Black Oaks. So here that is. In Giran, while raiding a storm vault, those repositories created by Sigmar in ages past to hide the most dangerous relics, Horticulus Slimux discovers the acorns of a black oak, a demonic tree whose roots can breach arcane barriers and poison great swaths of land. Slimux pauses only to plant the first oak himself before entrusting the remaining seeds to his most capable followers. Yet, to grow a black oak requires soil tilled with fresh bodies, and so an alliance of 3 contagiums begins to march on fertile ground. The Living City. Now, this is a very short story that comes, like I said, from the timeline, and it's in the Age of Sigmar, so it's happening like now within the greater scheme of the story arc. And what's interesting to me is that this is the same, I guess, amount of red herrings or story elements being thrown out there as when Gordrak got the God Beast skull and was marching towards Excelsius. Broken Realms Kragnos, Excelsius becomes the epicenter of a lot of action. Very meaningful things happened there. So we have a similar, I guess, intensity when it comes to this little story bite, also talking about Giran, the realm of life. And what I like about this story is it ties in a lot of elements that have been in the lore in the past, a lot of threads that existed, but that nothing really happened with them. For example, nothing happens story-wise with the Living City very much. It's a city that exists in the Cities of Sigmar battle tome. It's a huge bastion of order in the realm of life where, Alariel's forces and Sigmar's kind of have to work together and coexist, but nothing happens there. Like, Hammerhall is mentioned a lot, but nothing really happens in the Living City. So, if nothing else, the fact that they are at least, name-dropping important locations that we could recognize, I think is a win. Now, one thing about the Living City, and I picked this topic first because we're talking about the Living City being the target. If you don't know much about it, it is essentially a megalopolis, however you want to say it, but it's built into the trees of Giran. So it's this huge, I guess the first thought that comes to mind is like the teddy bear villages from Star Wars. They have the whole little set of gantries and stuff, and they have entire structures built into the sides of trees, that kind of thing. And because people have built vertically, it's an interesting thing because you have a massive city, but you don't have a massive city footprint necessarily. I'm sure it's big, I'm sure it takes up an immense amount of area, but the Living City can be built, upwards, not just outwards. And so this is a very interesting proposition because that means there's a huge concentration of fresh bodies, the things that they need to make this tree, whatever it is, grow right there. All we got to do is shake some trees. The bodies fall down to the ground. We plant the seed. Bada bing, bada boom. So that's the plan. But what I love is the fact that the character carrying out this plan is Horticulus Slimux. If you are not familiar with him, he is Nurgle's chosen gardener, right? Rotigus might be a closer representation to Nurgle by giving these benevolent gifts, and he's very jolly, and he's very traveling all over the place. Horticulus is sort of a different aspect of Nurgle. He is much more like a herald of Nurgle, meaning like an exalted plague bringer type or plague bearer type guy. And he is rumored to be one of the first demons created by Nurgle, one of the first beings created to start cultivating the Garden of Nurgle, which again, Nurgle without the Garden of Nurgle, the two are almost synonymous with one another. They conjure images of the other. So we have the most prolific gardener who just stumbled upon one of the most apparently devastating weapons for him. And that's a thing that just stands out in my mind with this story, is that these acorns of the black oak, they are not inherently a weapon, but when you put it in the hands of someone who understands the potential and how to get the most out of it, Horticulus, as the Grand Cultivator, makes it a weapon. Now, the story's pretty clear. He went and planted one at some point. Whether it's outside this storm vault, we don't have no idea really where it is. But somewhere in Giran, there is a black oak growing as we speak, because he at least planted one. Now, he gave the others to his thralls or whoever's beneath him, and they went out and were like, how do we get a bunch of bodies in one place to plant these acorns? And so they went and got 3 contagiums, which basically is just a big word for Nurgle armies, right? Massive war bands. Got 3 of those suckers together and was like, we're going to march on the living city, and then that's going to be the birthplace of our black oaks. But that doesn't mean Horticulix's is any less, and it doesn't mean it's anywhere near the other ones. And so kind of backing up a bit, it's interesting because this is, first of all, a new lore concept that's been introduced. The black oak has never, to my knowledge, at least in Age of Sigmar, been referenced. It might be an old world thing. If it is, please let me know. Like I said, I don't know a lot about the old world, unfortunately, so if it's there, I just missed it. But the idea is it's a non-Nurgle aligned tree that can rend reality, right? I mean, because there's nothing inherently Nurgle about it. Sigmar put it here because it's dangerous for sure. I don't know why he couldn't destroy it. That's a little unclear. But I don't see any reason why a Khorne army couldn't have grabbed the same thing and planted it. It just so happens that Horticulus is the one who is the Grand Cultivator and understands how to weaponize this piece of nature. And to its point, it's a very interesting thing because, as it says, a demonic tree whose roots can breach arcane barriers and poison great swaths of land. That's huge because we do know one thing about the new cities that are being established in the era of the beast, which we caught from the book Dominion by Darius Hinks, please go read it, is this idea of when a city is founded, they really do put up a kind of a spiritual barrier first. They harness the geomantic power of the area, and it kind of projects this energy field keeping demons and ghosts at bay, and then they build actual walls to support that against normal armies. And so the idea of a tree being able to burrow down and break those kinds of barriers while at the same time poisoning the land is extremely dangerous to some of these megacities that exist within the forces of order. Now, there's a few things about this weapon that are a bit I'm curious about, because there's no lore explanation for them. For example, how long does it take for them to grow? Or I should say, how long does it take for their growth to become dangerous? You know what I mean? Like, when does it become a weapon? Obviously, we get this sense of cultivation. I get the illusion it'll take some time, but that's not necessarily true when it comes to Nurgle. I mean, between Nurgle and Alariel, they can both just make life blossom and just explode onto the scene very, very quickly. So again, it's not quite the same, I guess, threat level to me as like Gordrak getting the God Beast skull, because that's a very simple math, right? We get the skull, we ram the gate, we make the money. That makes perfect sense to me. But when you're talking about like, we get the acorns, we grow the tree, we kill the people, like that's a longer equation, I feel like. Don't have a solid answer for you, but it's there. So let's talk about why this story is cool. Again, there's not much to it. All we know is Slimex has a new weapon, and him and a bunch of Nurgle forces have set their sights on the living city. That's really all the story is, but within it are a lot of threads that I think are very interesting. One, storm vaults are still relevant, and I point that out because it did feel for a little bit like after that the story arc with storm vaults dropped, they were just kind of like not mentioned for a while. So I like the fact that they're calling back on it, that there are still these reserves of immensely powerful weapons just out there. And if you are a warband or you're led by a leader who knows where they are, you can find them, and then you can just instantly supercharge your personal mission, whether that's for ill or good, it doesn't matter. There's just weapons. The idea of this black oak, whatever this tree is fascinating to me, not only because, obviously weaponizing nature is a cool thing. It's a theme that I touch on a couple of times when we talk about Nurgle, but also it doesn't inherently seem to have a chaos alignment. And I feel like with, ever since Broken Realms like Be'lakor, we've just been talking more about undivided chaos things. And I love that because there are so many facets to chaos that aren't locked into the big five, meaning the 4 chaos gods plus Skaven. Like, who else probably would have loved that acorn? Beasts of Chaos, absolutely, why not? They'll probably plant it inside the herdstone and then just drench the whole thing in blood and see if it can grow out of the rock. Like, that's rad! And we don't know who his, trusted associates are, but the idea that they went to 3 massive Nurgle armies, contagiums, which is like the grand term for an army, at least for Nurgle, is very interesting to me because we have seen some great stories between like Black Talon First Mark, some of the Stormcast one, I can't think of the name of it. But my point is we've seen Nurgle fortresses and forces and armies in Giran, and it's always such an interesting thing because I love the depiction of Nurgle armies. This mix of jolly and destructive and all these kinds of things. And now you're telling me we've just mobilized 3 of those whole things pointed at one city that's high up in the trees, and we're going to attack it with acorns. I'm in like Flynn. I love it. Now, I'm going to just stop here. My personal headcanon is Nurgle forces break into the living city. Instead of trying to go up the trees or anything like that, they just go straight into the dead center on the ground, where I'm sure there's city stuff too. Like, I'm sure that they have the ground populated in some way. But go there and then just try to poison the entire city from the bottom up. And I can absolutely see that working. And then maybe, I'm just throwing this out there as a few ideas for you, Black Library writers, maybe the black oak eggcorn starts killing the trees in the immediate area to kind of supercharge its growth. So now you have the trees that people are inhabiting as fortresses and stuff start to wilt, while the demonic presence, the dark energy, whatever tree, the black oak, starts to boom in its growth. And maybe the black oak's, branches come out and they like twist and gnarl around the existing trees and kind of crush them, choke them out, that kind of thing. I think there could be a lot of play there, some really cool stuff. And, at that point, even if the good guys manage to fight off the Nurgle forces and kill the tree functionally, the living city has changed permanently, right? I mean, I think that could be a really cool story arc, much like Excelsis got a really cool story arc in Broken Realms Kragnos. The whole place was super wrecked, but at the end of it, it still exists, and it had a really cool, battle happen there. That's what I'm talking about. Shoot me an email. I'll tell you where to send the checks for that idea. You guys got it. But friends, let me know your thoughts. What do you think the ramifications are of the greatest cultivator getting a biological weapon in the form of a tree, acorn I should say, and then he plants one? Where did he plant it? I don't know. I want to know what's going on with that, because no matter what happens with the living city, that means that this weird, nasty demon tree exists somewhere right now. We just don't know where. But then also, what do you think about bringing it into the living city? And the fact that the living city was brought into this story at all, I think is really cool. So let me know your thoughts in the description down below. I will respond to you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the thoroughly nasty oceans of the mortal realms, because today we are taking a page straight out of the Nurgle battle tome, talking about their interactions with the Idoneth deepkin. And so if you didn't know, I just finished recording the Idoneth deepkin lore video that just went out recently, and I had such a fun time. The first story I opened up to in the new Maggotkin book was a story where they were fighting deepkin, and I was like, oh yeah, this is too good, I gotta do it. So Nurgle versus deepkin, mirror match, but this time in a different battle tome. Now, today's story is fittingly called Plague Tides. As the Idoneth of the Skye Lane Enclave seek to return to the depths of Hish's refracted sea after a successful soul raid, they are confronted by a rotten-masted Carax on the horizon, the slime fleet of Gutrot Spume. Undaunted, the Akelian warriors seek to hold off the Nurgleites long enough for their fellows to escape, but are matched by the massed Puscoil Blightlords of the Drowned Men. The Idoneth retreat, not realizing the demon spoor now covering them due to their contact with the Maggotkin carry unique strains of contagion that can be tracked by Spume's navigators. Diving down within the hollowed-out carcasses of rotting leviathans, Spume and his Blight Kings emerge to trudge along the freezing ocean bed, their god-blessed resilience holding true even at such depths, and bring new horror to the unsuspecting elves of Skye Lane. That one was a hard one to get through because of the weird ways they always try to articulate Nurgle gross things, but here's the story essentially. We have an enclave that's not really mentioned a whole lot, the Skye Lane, and they are living in the realm of Hish, which is a bold move, seeing as how all of the Idoneth deepkin uniformly are terrified of Teclis. I like them. every day is giving him the middle finger if you live in his home, I guess. I don't know. But there they live in the far depths of the Shimmering Sea, and after a successful soul raid against who, we don't know, but I would love that story as well. They're heading back home and they just kind of look out in the sea like, hey, what is that? And it's just like a whole flotilla of dead animals, just kind of like a raft someone duct taped together and just kind of kicked off of a dock. This is an army. If you're not familiar, the Drowned Men are a sub-faction within the Maggotkin of Nurgle who owe allegiance to Gutrot Spume. Think of him as a pirate version of Nurgle. His ship is actually a dead carcass of a giant kraken. So they built the ship inside the kraken kind of a thing, or on top of it sort of, so the bow is exposed. And then the slime and grossness that exudes from this carcass allows them to travel across land as if it were water. Now in this case, they are on the sea, but he seems to be surrounded by other ships of similar ilk. Now I'm curious if the two armies actually saw each other at the same time, right? Like, did the deepkin look out, see this stuff going on, go, oh, we can't have this here. Surely we will go take the enemy. We can catch a few more souls on our way back in. And they went, picked a fight that they couldn't win and had to retreat. Or if, they just saw each other and like they knew there was going to be a conflict, so they had to engage. I don't actually know because I don't know the speed at which these ships travel, and if they hadn't engaged, then they wouldn't have gotten the tracer slime all over them. I guess what I'm getting at is it could have been the folly of the Achelian king to think, I can go take these guys, and in that decision he doomed his entire enclave, when he could have or should have just turned tail and ran. Nevertheless, a huge fight ensues, and this is all an open ocean. So you have the Maggotkin on their carcass ships, I'm going to call them, and the deepkin in the sea. Now, of course, there's a lot of things going on in the air because the ether sea can project the ability to fly, basically, for their undersea creatures. You got the eels kind of moving around in the sky, that kind of stuff. And they are matched blow for the Pusgoyle Blight Lords. One thing to note, the Drowned Men are exceptionally renowned for their Pusgoyle Blight Lords. Essentially, they kind of operate with some level of naval tactics. You put your huge flagship straight up the center, and then you engulf your enemy with smaller vessels. In this case, the Kraken ship goes up straight up to the raiding party of Achelians, and then a flood of Pusgoyle Blight Lords descends to basically take care of their armed forces. So anyone riding an eel, Leviathans, all that kind of stuff. I would love a blow-by-blow of this. Like, how much did the Deepkin forces lose before they turned and ran for a retreat? That's an interesting question because it does matter, like, what the fighting force is left when they get home. Now, normally, when Deepkin attack, they typically have this ability to project fear in such a way that nobody remembers that they were there. And that's not really mentioned in this story, which is an odd exclusion. Normally, you would imagine that the Deepkin would get their tails kicked, they would run away, but then everyone who's left would be like, wait, were we just fighting? What's going on? Why are we here? Why is this guy dead? Like, they would have no memory of the event whatsoever. They'd be wiped clean. Whether that happened and they just followed this trail of slime because it was there and they had no other clues, that's also a possibility. Or if whatever memory shenanigery didn't work on the Maggotkin for any reason. Regardless, in this combat, they essentially the Deepkin take on a type of toxin that is traceable. And so they essentially do the thing that Deepkin never do. You lead someone to your home. Their whole existence, as I mentioned in the previous video, is built on secrecy, of not being found, staying low key. And they just gave an entire army of one of Nurgle's favorite champions, Gutrot Spume, a rope leading directly to their house. Now, Gutrot Spume is an interesting character. He really deserves an updated video of his own. He's featured in many Black Library novels. He is a champion of Nurgle, a mortal champion who's had a lot of mutations, who's constantly trying to prove himself. He's kind of that Korgus Kull level of character, I would say a little bit more so maybe, where it's just a champion that's really far along in their path to glory, but constantly gets foiled at the end before they can attain demonhood. He runs his warband like he runs a ship, which is kind of cool. I really like that a lot. It's a great chain of command system. And so they follow this trail directly to where it leads. Now, there's a problem, of course. The Deepkin their natural defenses are just the crushing darkness and depths of the ocean itself. The way that they remedy this, I've never heard of before, but apparently this is canon now, is they took a bunch of Leviathan shells or bodies, carcasses, piled inside of them, and then just sunk them. So they're using these things as little tiny, like, submarine apparatuses, sort of, and then just sinking all the way to the bottom, and the crushing depths don't really bother them because, well, they're Maggotkin and they're totally fine. Once they get to where the enclave is and get within sort of the effects of the ether sea, they can breathe. So like any air that they had to bring with them was only enough to get to the bottom. And while the accounts of what happened here aren't really given, the fact that we don't know what Skye Lane as an enclave is and has not really been mentioned anywhere else is not really indicative of a good time had by all. What I imagine is that the deepkin got there first, of course, because they went home, and explained everything that was going on. There was probably a lot of controversy and arguments about what to do because some of their animals are clearly infected, right? If they're catching something enough to lead the entire army to them, some people are sick. I wonder if they lost any of the souls that they had in that raid in the process, and then they had to explain that. Like, there's a lot of politicking that happens before the Nurgle forces ever arrive, because just an encounter with Nurgle that you had to retreat from never ends at the battle because of the nature of disease and pestilence and all that kind of stuff. And it's while they're having all these squabbles that the carcass of a giant leviathan drops from the sky in their little bubble that is their enclave, smashes to the ground, and Blight Kings start coming out. Now, we do know that the Deepkin build their enclaves in a defensive way. Like, they're meant to, first of all, be hidden, more than anything, but also there are, like, chambers, antechambers, sections they can seal off, different corridors that they can seal. We know it's a rather defensive setup, just by the way that they shape the coral around them, but honestly, even coral itself is still a living organism, no matter how strong it is. So I can imagine once the Blight Kings hit the bottom, it would not take much to unleash enough disease to naturally decay the defenses around them. Because the speed at which entropy happens near Nurgle stuff is like way fast forward. Like, you can see things rot in real time. So I can absolutely imagine, these carcasses landing in the enclave. Not really sure what to think about them at first, and then all of a sudden the Blight Kings burst out, Gutrot Spume's hacking people apart. Probably caught them with their defenses down. I'm sure some of the walls are rotting away. And we don't get a definitive answer as to whether or not the enclave is completely wiped out. It just says, and bring a new horror to the unsuspecting elves. So, like, they could have survived, but here's the thing. We know Gutrot didn't die, so they would have had to have pushed him out somehow without saying it. I don't know. It seems like this is a death level event. Because the Deepkin exist on such a razor's edge by going extinct from just not having any kids with souls in them. Like, that's a constant thing. These soul raids allow them to keep their species alive. We have no reason to think that these souls were transferred, so they're still suffering the losses they had before, on top of that rampant disease I'm sure they brought back with them, and now you hit them in their home base. And honestly, it doesn't take much to tip over those scales of survival. If you clean out enough of the higher ranking castes and they're now unable to go retrieve souls efficiently, you've effectively destroyed the enclave. Whether or not you killed every single person there, you just have to take out enough to successfully soul raid, and you have doomed them. And I mean, it could even be, depending on how careful their environment is maintained, just dropping a bunch of disease and plague on those things, especially anything that can ruin coral or like natural reefs and that kind of stuff, easily could just destroy this entire enclave. If nothing else, they would at least have to move, which is its own huge, unprecedented process, because an entire enclave, again, they're trying to remain secret. They don't want to move. So either way, these guys are having a bad day. And so let's talk about why this is cool. Again, part of it was just I saw a story that featured Maggotkin and Deepkin, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to do this, just the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of now the Maggotkin have the upper hand. These are also great stories because anytime anyone attacks the Deepkin themselves, they have to come up with some like ludicrous way to get there. I think the Skaven at one point built a submarine fleet that was just like rickety and half of them blew up on the way. There's like warp holes getting gnawed into reality under there and draining the ocean. In this, they all hurtle up inside of a bunch of dead animals and just sink themselves like rocks. I'm like, oh yeah, I don't know how you got out of that. Not even asking any questions. I'm not even mad. I'm impressed. It's like if Luke Skywalker crawled into the Tauntaun and then just got transported somewhere else. Like, oh, this is nice. And it's a great, example of why Nurgle is so dangerous. It's not about the actual battlefield contact. It's so much more than that. It's the diseases that those Idoneth deepkin brought back to their enclave. It's the diseases that allowed the Maggotkin to track them. Like, there's so many things that happen after a battle with Nurgle that you still have to deal with, whereas a force like Khorne, if you smash the army's gone, that's it. But the lingering and kind of deadly nature of Nurgle and his diseases stays with you, the person who was fighting, and the battlefield. That entire environment is now soiled. I think this story, along with the other one we talked about with the Deepkin, make fantastic, either campaigns or just one-off novels where you get to see these forces. How does that rot and ruin affect the Corallium and all of their defenses? And how is it shutting off, say, the Achelians from the Isharan? Are they in two different corridors, like two different halls, and now they're divided? There's a bunch of cool narrative opportunities here for storytelling. You can make some really compelling battle scenes. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is kind of a logical note here, is that this means that Gutrot Spume is in Hysh, which is not massively important, but we don't often get insight into where a lot of these named characters are at any given time. It's kind of like, I just show up here because Nurgle sent me, right? But this is a cool one. I'd love it if they had a future campaign, maybe against the Tyrian army, where Gutrot Spume was there at the center of it all. We know he's here now. Like, he's not going to stop at one enclave. What are your thoughts? Do you think he's headed towards something specific or has a specific mission, or he's just kind of chilling out? I would love to know. Leave in the comments down below, and we'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming, friends. Welcome, Wargamers. Doug here from 2+ Tough, and today we are diving into the Nurgle Battle Tome, the Maggotkin of Nurgle, that is, and pulling a story out of there to give us a great vision of what Nurgle is like in the era of the Beast. It's certainly something I was curious about, because it's really our first depiction of chaos in this new section. Like, how are some of the Chaos Gods responding to this, and what do they think of Kragnos, and all those kinds of things? Well, we're going to get into that and more, concluding with our thoughts on what I'm excited for when it comes to the Maggotkin in particular. And now, just as promised, we're going to jump to the Maggotkin of Nurgle Battle Tome and start with a story called The Blighted Beast. Across the realms, the champions of Nurgle feel a quickening in their viscous blood. The cosmos thrashes with violent intent as the hordes of destruction suddenly embark on a massive offensive, spurred into a frenzy by the return of the primordial earthquake god Kragnos. This deity styles himself as the end of empires, and his followers do not care whom they trample. Maggotkin fortresses that only just withstood the undead are assailed again by the hordes. Many fall, even Plaguespire, one of Giran's mightiest Nurglite citadels, has its outer walls brought down by Grot sappers with no sign of the siege abating anytime soon. In this era of the Beast, most Maggotkin can do little but endure, though even their resilience is hard-pressed against such fervor. More enterprising champions deliberately seek out marauding orcs and ogres, prolonging battle until their foes are thoroughly infected before withdrawing into zones of corruption. The barbarous armies soon press on towards the empires of the Maggotkin's rivals, so crazed with battle lust and the resonating energies of the Great Stomp that they don't realize they are now carrying hyper-contagious diseases. Some cruel boy warclans even bargain with Nurgle sorcerers to infect their Grot lackeys so they can send them ahead to weaken prospective foes. Despite the rising threat, Nurgle is pleased. Hundreds of new vectors of contagion now spread far swifter than his own trotting hosts could ever accomplish alone. I think this story ultimately points out the unyielding eternal optimism that is Nurgle. Like, he got really bummed like everybody else did during the necroquake of the Soul Wars, because death magic, it just brought everything down, man. But now life is booming, and when life is booming, Nurgle is at his most joyous. Life is abundant, which means that so is entropy given enough time. Whether it's rotting animals that have died because they had a population boom and are now being hunted out, to feed even larger populations of people, like their rotting corpses. Maybe it's just so much fruit from overabundant harvests that now rot because the people literally can't eat it fast enough. Like the ritual of life, which ultimately led to Kragnos' release, which is depicted in the story, is a massive realms-wide setting change. And Nurgle is so up to the task. It just says straight up, like, he's just a happy guy. He's pleased. This is all going according to the plan, right? Things are getting sick. There's more life, which of course means more death, more natural cycles, more things breaking down, and he could not be more stoked about it. There is, however, a problem, because things can't go smoothly, right? This isn't Peacehammer, Age of Peace. The issue is that the way that his armies were conducting themselves in terms of ground warfare before just can't keep up. It used to be that, Nurgle would form these large, implacable armies, and they would just march slowly forward, infecting things as they went. They would attack another fortress, and maybe not actually kill them outright, but certainly plant enough disease to where that fort is going to fall apart on its own anyway, and they would come and conquer it again, and so forth and so on, and just kind of spread slowly over massive swaths of land. They could speed things up faster by corrupting a waterway, perhaps, or maybe a deep well. But Nurgle is not renowned, at least in the lore, for speed. Game-wise, he gets pretty up there. But in lore, it takes a lot of time for these huge sections of land and continents to be conquered and thoroughly corrupted. However, when the Rite of Life goes off, Kragnos is set free, and that has a ripple effect across all of, just destruction armies in general, because they lacked a cohesive, unifying figure. I think the difference between Kragnos and, say, Gordrakk, who was kind of before Kragnos slated to be this singular leading body, is Kragnos isn't any one of their species. He's his own thing. Whereas Gordrakk, I think, was always going to favor Orcs over, say, Ogres or Grots or something like that. There's just something about being removed from the situation and being a beacon that everyone can unify around that gives Kragnos his own power. And in doing so, he sets off hordes of all of these factions. Gloomspite gets roving everywhere, ogres trying to eat everything, sons of Behemoth, orcs of all different kinds of war clans. It's just madness. And so, life is booming, but it takes time for the fruits of that life, meaning entropy and the natural cycles of decay, to take root. So Nurgle's seeing a lot of potential, but it's not coming yet because it takes time. What he is seeing in the meantime, however, is a lot of martial resistance, because these warbands are surging everywhere, punching everything that they can see. And so that old, slow, implacable warband that just didn't quit before isn't working, because in the era of the beast, it's getting assaulted and chipped away by these warbands of orcs and maw tribes and everything. It's just chipping them away, and so they just kind of collapse in on themselves at a certain point. Maybe they go through the wrong, neighborhood, so to speak, and the area is turned into a thick swamp, and they really struggle to move through that, like physically walk through it, because they're so fat and bulky, and the ground kind of eats them up. Like, there's just a lot of ways that war clans in particular can mess with Maggotkin from a lore perspective. However, Nurgle is adaptable, and some of the best champions are as well. Because the little micro story that we have here, without even giving any names or anything, is just some warband leaders, they take small forces that are highly contagious, they go out, and they just fight enough to get every one of their opponents sick. And then they just run away. They just retreat. And so what's interesting is that from a Nurgle perspective, that's not really how they fight. They're not a hit and run force, right? You're thinking, that's how the Sylvaneth fight Nurgle, not how Nurgle fights anybody else. But it's for a purpose, because of course, when they did that fight and then retreated to a corrupted place to where the orcs didn't really want to go, gave them a little bit of a reprieve. It shored up some of the number losses that Nurgle was having by keeping their losses minimal from an army perspective. But the diseases that they infected upon those warbands are now being carried by those warbands further and wider than Nurgle forces ever could. They're essentially using them as like the disease demons of Postmates, just sending them everywhere. And this is interesting because it requires a few things from the disease itself. It has to be highly transmissible. It has to be, carryable, meaning there's not going to be like so much natural resistance that it dies out in transit while it's on the orc. And then it also needs to be devastating when it gets there, but not immediately to kill the host carrying it to the next objective. It needs to kind of be a sleeper disease. They fight the orcs now have enough time to keep the infection going, move to the next location, infect that populace, and it destroys that. Whether or not the orcs are immune to whatever this disease is, that would be the perfect thing. If they were like an immune carrier of all these things, that would be a blast for Nurgle. But that's all speculation. Really what we're getting at is that a lot of the warlords are starting to adapt. how do we survive in the era of the beast? Well, we have these territories. We've already corrupted and claimed them. Nobody wants them, which is good for us, right? You have some hidey place to go back to, these corrupted lands. But instead of just marching massive armies out there and showing martial force, which Nurgle was never super into before either, instead, let's play it smart. We're going to use these new enemies as our own disease vectors, new ways to introduce things into the population. Maybe our battle plans before the Rite of Life were to go attack, and this city, I'm going to make one up, Greywall. Or we were going to go siege Greywall, but now this orc warband is already doing it. Well, heck, why don't we just give you guys some diseases, whether through working with a shaman and infecting some of his dudes, like a parlay kind of deal, or just straight fighting you and infecting you the old-fashioned way, and then sending you that way. We still get the end result that we want. The city will be destroyed, it will be full of plague, and it will be madness, but now it's 2 birds, 1 stone. And if on top of that we lose fewer Nurgle guys by doing that than marching the whole army out, this is all wins. Everything's coming up Millhouse. But keep in mind, that is only for the generals who adapt. Because I'm sure we will find stories in this book, and there are actually ones after that specific tale, of just people going out and getting slaughtered because they're not reading the room, right? They're not paying attention to how things have changed. The realms are so much more dangerous now. Nurgle is used to coming into an area, infecting it so utterly and completely that there's not much natural resistance to them outside of other factions. But with the Rite of Life, flora and fauna are booming so intensely that it's not a given that you can just be safe by your mere presence of disease. And so it's the warlords who can use their brains, not monetize, but work with other factions to get these diseases out there as best they can, to use their enemies rather than being used. It just makes them fantastic. And in the end, Nurgle is always happy, right? He loves it. And so I want to end this video like I end all of them, just kind of chatting every once in a while about why I love this, right? What makes this story so stinking cool? Well, for me, the Chaos Gods are something that some lore readers really love, the stagnancy of them. Like, that's kind of their asset, that they are this eternal, primordial enemy. They don't change, with the exception of Tzeentch, who doesn't change in his ever-changingness, paradoxically. But with Nurgle here, what we're getting a sense of, like, the craftiness of these Chaos Warband leaders. Like, Nurgle may not change, he likes disease and disease is spreading, but the craftiness of their followers has to adapt, and seeing that is actually really cool. It's one of those things, like, we start to see factions who, here's a new threat, and then another faction has to do something, invent something, or come up with a way to compensate, and then they innovate their own thing, and then the enemy has to innovate again. And so this all happens in real life. World War I was full of these kinds of very, I'm going to call them tragic innovations of warfare, of kind of like getting the upper hand and wrestling it from your opponent. The craftiest people are the ones who rise to the top, who can walk in, assess a situation, and formulate a practical solution. And so when you talk about on a warband level, what is our mission? It's not to fight and kill. That's not what Nurgle's about. It's about the disease and the spread and the corruption. So, with that being our goal, instead of fighting, how can we use what is in our toolbox here, meaning the roving warbands around you, your safety spot within the corrupted lands? Like, let's just start using our resources more wisely and adapt to the situation, and we will have greater gains in the end. And when you have that kind of like inspirational and positive outlook on things, but you apply it to something that is so horrifying and patently evil, like chaos corruption, it becomes this very interesting story. You can start to see, these very villainous characters that are probably very interesting to learn about, coming up with these crazy plans that you're like, well, that makes sense, but it shouldn't because it's terrible, but it does kind of, it clicks. And to me, like, that's what the best depictions of Chaos Warlords are. I also really liked the way that they did that with the Call of Archaon series. Like, those warlords are not just muscle and going out and ramming your army across the plains of Gur. Instead, it's just, who's the smartest person? Who can figure this puzzle out? That's who Khorne wants. That's who Nurgle, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, or Archaon want. Those are the heroes that stand out, and those are the characters that are enjoyable to follow. So friends, let me know your thoughts. If you have backstory for your own particular, plague legion, so to speak, let me know your thoughts on what's going on with the overall setting. Is Nurgle pleased with your warband, and how are they adapting to the new era of the beast? I'd love to read it in the comments down below. Everyone, thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the putrescent waters of the Mortal Realms as we take a look at a story straight out of the Maggotkin of Nurgle battle tome to explore the Tainted Waters. The river tribes of northern Invidia successfully drive back a host of Nurgle demons from their lands, slaying hundreds in a great battle at the Fork of Minute. Yet so much plague-bearer blood is spilled into the life-giving waters of one of these pristine waterways that they become clogged and putrescent. Unable to drink the tainted liquid or feed upon the rotting, bloated fish within, the Invidian tribes are stricken by terrible thirst and hunger. In desperation, they pray to any gods or higher powers that might listen for rainfall and for sorely needed food. Rotigus, the generous, hears their call. The great unclean one summons a pestilential downpour of ooze that overflows the banks of the Minute River and swamps the tribespeople's lands. It brings with it bountiful diseases, mutations, and other grotesque blessings. Choosing damnation over obliteration, the survivors of the river tribes finally accept these gifts. Thereafter, they refer to themselves as the Grey Deluge. This pious ravager horde travels far and wide extolling the virtues of its savior, and the slaughtering of any who shun the Rainfather's magnanimous offerings. So I like this story. We're going to get into why in a little bit here, but one thing I do want to start off is just talking about the setting. So we don't actually know where this Fork of Minute, I think it's Minuet. I couldn't actually find that on a map. However, it does say clearly that it's in Invidia, which is a location that we actually know from several stories. Invidia comes up as being the staging ground for a lot of Nurgle armies throughout the lore. Most recently, it was in Broken Realms Teclis. That's actually where Manfred went to go and corrupt the Realm Gate there to kind of feed back into the Shyish Nadir. Now, ultimately he was stopped, but the fact that he was there, and if you read that section or watch that video that I did covering it, there was 3 fairly large Nurgle armies there on that island. It's also come up numerous times throughout the lore in terms of campaigns and that kind of stuff, as far as like when we're trying to find a place where like Nurgle is really, really impressive, Invidia seems to be a reoccurring location. And so my assumption is this story, the Tainted Waters, it does happen in the Age of Chaos, but it's happening specifically at the time where Invidia is really coming under attack. Now, we don't have as much information about how Nurgle got into realms as, say, Khorne or Tzeentch, where these big, singular catastrophic events let them in. With Nurgle, it seems to be much more of a slow creep, and I would not be surprised if Invidia was where that creep began. And for that reason, I love this story, because to me, it's like a snapshot of a centuries-long war that's not contained to a battlefield. And this is what I mean, like, we saw the defenders, right? I'm just going to call them the river tribes. That's kind of what the name they give them. They actually won the fight, right? Like, no gods came on their side. Alariel wasn't there. They still won the fight, but the aftermath of that conflict still rages upon them. In so many Black Library novels, like, they kind of work up to a big, final battle between the good guys and the bad guys, and the good guys tend to win. But this is a situation where it's like, when I say it's a snapshot of a centuries-long war, what I mean is, yeah, they won that fight, and I'm sure they all felt really great, but in the grand scheme, it was nothing. It was nothing but a roadblock that led to more misery down the road. And that's where you get to see, like, the full scope of how, like, frankly, messed up and screwed everybody was during the Age of Chaos. Every victory is just one part of a larger defeat. And I like the fact that this story brings up some things that are very practical, right? A lot of these, when it gets into Nurgle, it's like, very intense mutations and all these wild things happening. But the truth is, like, thirst and famine are real issues that have destroyed multiple civilizations in our real world, right? Like, in fact, waterways have been important in Giran before. We know that so much of the realm lives and dies by the water flow. A good example of this is in the Realm Gate Wars. There was a great unclean one who basically sat in a river and crapped in it, and he basically corrupted everything downstream. So one of the first acts that they did was getting rid of him. Because they have an ecosystem where everything is connected, much like we do, and so adding a corrupting presence to that is absolutely devastating. It affects everything downriver and then like further down in your ecosystem chain. And while we often talk about why, societies would fall to chaos. There's a precious few stories where it actually shows people like before and after they became chaos warriors or their tribe fell to chaos or whatever. But I love these like very practical ones that are easy to conceive of, right? We won the fight. Alariel didn't help us. It was all us. And when the aftermath of that victory left us starving and thirsty, we became desperate. And you know who helped? Not Alariel. And I can see that kernel of spite like manifesting in them. The fact that it isn't a second army of demons that comes and turns them, it's not, again, another big momentous battle, but an actual granting of their wishes makes Nurgle more palatable. Of course, they chose a corrupt god who listens over a pure goddess who remained silent, which is a decision that makes more sense as you look at your starving, and thirsty children and the rest of your tribe and that kind of stuff. And so at times like these, I look at this story and I'm like, that's actually makes perfect sense. I mean, if you can't beat them, join them. I mean, once you are already at the point of desperation with food and water, and like the only thing that happens is it starts raining slop and ooze, like what do you do? How do you fight against that? There's no way. And I kind of like that because it's they fought and won against the army of Nurgle, but they didn't win against like the power of Nurgle, right? The power of Nurgle is all about despair and sadness and kind of forlorn hope, that kind of stuff. They couldn't beat that. They could just beat, plague bearers all day with swords, but they couldn't beat despair. And that's a really interesting take. And that's why, fundamentally, this is a warband, the Grey Deluge, that was formed essentially from despair rather than necessarily a conquering army who subjugated them and intentionally tortured and twisted them into something chaotic. They just birthed that way because they just reached a point where there was nothing else to do. And on top of that, it features one of my favorite characters, which is Rotigus. Now, we've talked about him before, but one of the things that is unique about Rotigus, and obviously is very relevant to the story, is that he has a big ears, right? He's always listening for prayers. In this story, they go pretty much and spell out the fact that they're praying to any god, any higher power who will listen. And the thing is, when you call out into the void, you never know who's listening and who's going to answer. Because Rotigus is all too happy to deliver rain to barren fields and dry rivers, bountiful foods and, plants that pollinate and burst with life. Of course, to him, it's an actual flood of life. To us, it's a horrific downpour of disease and pestilence and slop. But it's a concept that not a lot of other characters even wade into. The idea of how many other characters do we know of that actively listen to the prayers of mortals who are not deities, right? Like, Rotigus isn't. He just is a really good listener, and he provides what you're asking for, as long as what you're asking for is something that he can do in a really Nurgle-y way. And so for that reason, I think he's a fantastic character. Like, it's just, that's his unique shtick to me, right? People can talk about how his unique thing is that he, does a lot of stuff with rain and he loves having big hordes of demons. It's like, no, his unique selling point is that he actively, as an emissary of Nurgle, goes out, listens to prayers, and delivers. And he delivers in the most miserable way, because if your prayer gets answered and it's not what you want and it was your last hope, you're broken, right? That despair that we mentioned before becomes overwhelming and crushing, which is such a weird weapon to think about, but it really truly is. And that's really why I like Nurgle quite a bit, is just weaponized sadness or despair. There's something about that. And Rotigus is the true embodiment of it, because he's answering your prayers in a way that fills you with absolute despair. Now, these warriors go on to become the Grey Deluge. Not my favorite name. Personally, if I was going to name these guys, I would have gone with something probably about provision, like how, Rotigus provided rain and sustenance for them. I mean, essentially, at the end of the story, they're going out like proselytizing, like, hey, everyone should love Nurgle because he's our savior. He answered our prayers about water and we're all good now, that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously they look like bloated, nasty zombies, but, I feel like that would be a better name as opposed to Grey Deluge, which just kind of sounds like, I don't know, runoff water from a gutter. All right, friends, so why is this story so cool? What about the Tainted Waters back in the Age of Chaos is so awesome? Well, to me, it does a great job of demonstrating what makes Nurgle so powerful, right? That he's not just a leader of an army, but he is a true infection upon the realms. And I've said this before in other stories, and I point it out whenever it comes, because it doesn't come out enough in my opinion, but so whenever I see it, I want to highlight it. If you were to put all, 4 to 5, if you count the Great Horned Rat, Chaos Gods in one area and say, conquer everything, you're going to have some different ways to go about it, okay? Like, the most direct and straightforward is going to be Khorne. He's going to build armies, he's going to go, and he's going to just conquer, right? He's going to go from place to place to place, smashing everything in his way. Tzeentch is largely going to do something very similar. The Great Horned Rat, he's going to do whatever he's going to do. He's got a whole, under Empire thing. And Slaanesh, they tend to do something very similar. Rush out and just go conquer things, have big fights, lots of thrills, all that stuff. But with Nurgle, he brings something different to the table, and stories like this actively make it clear to us. Because the nature of disease and infection and spreading and that kind of stuff, contagion as a weapon, is so different than a actual boots to the ground army. Nurgle can have an army in one location, but as long as that location is upstream, it can reasonably corrupt just about anything downstream, which allows him to project his danger and his power and his influence far further than a marching army ever could. And it works both ways. Not only does he project his threat much further by corrupting everything around them, but also, let's say the defenders try to take back land. If you take back land from Khorne, it's just a crumpled old fort. You can just, reconstitute it, rebuild it, whatever you want to do. But taking back land from Nurgle is so much more difficult because he changes the ecosystem. The entire environment is all in a whack. It takes a lot of time for the actual realms to heal. He has a unique weapon that is just his presence. And I never thought that was highlighted enough. I mean, obviously, for the purposes of, a war game, they also focus on heroes a lot and the deeds of the putrid Blight Kings and that kind of stuff. But when you really read about how he's been able to take over such large quantities of Giran, a lot of it has very little to do with boots on the ground. It's just the projection of this disease and plague that is corrupting everything as it touches it. Which, to be honest, I think makes his military campaigns far more interesting. Having that kind of ability to project disease and that kind of stuff so far away, it just makes me think that, Khorne would target major settlements or strongholds or fortifications, something like that. But Nurgle, if he just targets, all of the rivers or the rivers, ponds, ocean beds, that kind of stuff, and just corrupts them, everything downstream gets messed up, and so they can just come and just knock off whatever defenders are left. And for that reason, I absolutely love any story that features Nurgle using disease and blight and contagions as weapons without a whole lot of focus on warriors per se. But another great thing about this story is it just really showcases why people fall to chaos. And that, honestly, when it comes to Nurgle specifically, I always kind of think that that's the hard part. I can understand someone looking at a really ripped Khorne warrior who's just super badass and he's got an awesome axe in his hand. You'd be I want to be like that guy, right? He might be evil and do evil things, but you can look at his cool armor and his neat trim and be that guy is cool, I want to be that. How do you look at a Blight King and you're yeah, buddy? It's just a very specific person who can look at the body of a Blight King and be I'm on board, sign me up. At least compared to the others. With Slaanesh, you got a lithe body. Tzeentch, you probably have some mutations, but you generally look very cool. Maybe lots of colors on you. But Blight Kings are you're fat and dumpy, but you're also the best. But this is a great example of how people fall to the powers of chaos, specifically Nurgle, of course, without soldiers having to be there. They don't have to look at a chaos warrior of Nurgle and be looks like you've got it all figured out, buddy. Sign me up, right? It's more these environmental circumstances that push them towards a terrible decision. A Pyrrhic victory where they beat the forces of Nurgle on their own, but in doing so, corrupt everything around them. The fact that Alarielle is not answering in her own realm. I'm not sure, this doesn't really give us a good point of reference about where she is. Maybe she's out fighting. She could already be in her, winter aspect, all kind of depressed in her little hidden realm. We don't know, but I understand the desperation to survive and then just the feeling of absolute hopelessness when, it starts to rain, but the rain is just poison. I get it. I get how it can break people and what it can do to folks. So for that reason, I think this is a perfect story to showcase when it comes to why would anyone fall to Nurgle, especially whole people groups rather than individuals. This is a fantastic story to illustrate that. So, friends, let me know your thoughts on the Tainted Waters. If you have a better name for this warband than the Grey Deluge, leave in the comments down below. I'll pin the best one to the top. And thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to a new kind of content, for me at least. And right up top, I want to ask for your help in making the channel better by asking for feedback on this format. You see, for the longest time, I've been covering lore for books that were already out, right? There were several when I started, or I was stopping to cover the newest release. But there's two problems with this, of course. First, once I cover a book, I rarely go back to it. And next, when there is a lull in Age of Sigmar releases, the well tends to run dry. And so I wanted to try something to give myself a reason, right, content-wise, to bust out these older battle tomes that I've already covered and go just a little bit deeper with them, looking specifically at what I call the timeless timeline of various armies, and essentially asking, why is this story so cool? Every battle tome has one of these timelines towards the beginning of it, and they're just these little narrative hooks to start showing you what this army is like as it interacts with the greater universe. We're going to talk about the forces involved, what it says about the combatants, what lasting impact this has on the mortal realms as a lore piece, and even how I would recreate this exact story using battle plans and battalions and armies and that kind of stuff. And so that's the intention, and your feedback would mean the world to me. Let's dig in. Diplomacy is a very messy thing. It's difficult to communicate and work with others to a mutually beneficial decision. And in that messiness, emergencies can turn into catastrophes, alliances get severed, and unforgivable acts can be put on for full display. These issues with diplomacy and the tangled web that it creates between factions is frankly why we play Warhammer and not Peacehammer, because frankly, war is much easier than trying to coordinate peace. But there's one specific instance of this that I want to highlight in today's lore exploration. See, I was reading my Maggotkin of Nurgle battle tome again, and in the timeline I noticed this little blurb that stuck out to me in a way that I hadn't quite before. A small story called The Fastness Beset. Now I'm going to read it to you now. An immense horde of Rotbringers, plague demons, slaves to darkness, and Nurgle-worshipping Brayherds advanced upon the Greywater fastness. Knowing the power of the city's super weapons, they began to systematically poison the lands around it, with filth pits and feculent gnarlmaws. As the forces of order counterattacked, a churning war zone developed. Now, to fully understand that story, we need to dissect it just a bit, because there's actually a lot in there. First off, let's set the scene. Greywater Fastness is one of the founding cities of the Pantheon of Order. It's located in Giran, in what was once a thick forest, or at least an open field. These initial cities of order are really interesting to me, and you can always go watch my Cities of Sigmar series, and because they're all very unique and they're all very complex. They have to be able to balance the lives of so many different kinds of residents. You got humans, elves, dwarves, and so on, that kind of thing, and be some of the most best fortified locations in the realms, because the minute that Sigmar or Alariel draw the line in the sand, the forces of chaos are going to try and cross it. But Greywater Fastness was established in the realm of life, mostly populated by Duarden, but all races can make an appearance. And the reason that this city is so important is because of what it manufactures. Guns. Guns, cannons, rockets, tanks, gunpowder, ammunition, and more. The leaders of these cities of Sigmar, when they were first kind of mapping out how they're going to retake the realms, figured out real quick, okay, well, if you want to retake that territory, it begins in a factory, right, where weapons of war are created in massive numbers. Greywater Fastness is a place of industry, labor, and production. And while it's not, the only city that makes guns, of course you can write your own lore behind one, and all these other cities I'm sure produce weapons on some level, it's their bread and butter. And what makes them unique amongst the other major cities of order. It's a big deal and a vitally important location, and that's why this city matters so much. But the reason that this city is where it is was thanks to resources. Giran is a place full of resources like metal ore, wood, coal, various kinds of acids and water, and all those things are integral to weapon creation. The barrel, the stocks, acids for chemicals, wood and coal keep the forges hot. It's all right there. And so what happens when an incredibly important city with an immense, fortified structure and walls and all this kind of stuff drops itself into an active war zone as a wacky buffer between chaos and the other forces of order? And I say dropped in, I know it took time to build the city, but the War of Life has been raging around it for literally hundreds of years. The Nurgle versus Giran conflict predates Greywater fastness is what I'm saying. So this city was built right in the middle of all these things going on. And that is the place from our little, blurb. So let's talk about the aggressors. This incredibly formidable army of Nurgle, Rotbringers and demons and slaves to darkness and Nurgle beasts of chaos, are all still actively fighting the War of Life and then turn to face Greywater fastness. It's a description of forces that we don't see a whole lot, and my assumption is that this is a truly massive army. But they chose to take the fight to Greywater fastness in a very specific way. Normally when I see Beasts of Chaos in a lineup, I assume there's going to be a lot of run forward directly into gunfire and die, because quite frankly that's what Beasts of Chaos do best. Much could be said for many Slaves to Darkness units, as they're constantly trying to curry favor with the Dark Gods and their champions, as far as being hyper aggressive and not really thinking much, but this army was clever. They understood the weapons that lied within the Greywater fastness, and so they kind of more went for a scorched earth approach, right? Poisoning the land and its rivers, basically all the resources that I said before, well now they're either unavailable due to contamination, or you literally can't get them because you can't leave the city safely. And so this kicks off a very traditional siege. We'll wait them out, the diseases will work their way into the city because someone, won't wash their hands or whatever, and then it'll be in there and they'll rot from the inside out. Now, what I like here is the vagueness of that last line. As the forces of order counterattacked, a churning war zone developed, very open-ended. However, we actually know what happened because it was later recorded in the Cities of Sigmar book, and I'll go ahead and read that now. During these seasons of war, the fortress city's iron-weld gun batteries and the luminarch arrays of the Collegiate Arcane decimated the bestial hordes that threatened to tear the city down. But the cataclysm they unleashed rendered the land around the city all but inhabitable. This region, known as the Ghoul Mere, is populated by vengeful woodland spirits who prey upon any mortals foolish enough to stray from the heavily guarded trade roads. Led by the mysterious tree lord known as Pale Oak, the Sylvaneth that dwell here have clashed several times with the armies of Greywater. Only the threat of undead invaders and rampaging warbands of chaos has prevented the outbreak of total war between these two seemingly incompatible cultures. Now, of course, it is possible that this refers to a separate event, but the fact that it includes Beasts of Chaos, which were specifically mentioned in the Nurgle one, I think this is really the only, and the fact that it's really the only major event that Greywater fastness has, I think it's very reasonable to link the two. So, here's what I think happened, right? Tinfoil hat time. Nurgle forces begin the siege of the city by essentially isolating it with disease. There's no supplies coming in or out. The people within Greywater fastness immediately saw this and were like, not today, and they sent out a counterattack to push the plague armies back. Seeing their prey out in the open for the first time, the Beasts of Chaos couldn't contain themselves and ran forward, possibly against orders, right? It's sort of a cascading effect like Leroy Jenkins style where, one party of your group rushes in, and now if the rest of the Nurgle army stays still, they just lose the Beast of Chaos because they're all dead. So, instead, you get pulled in and everybody rushes forward. By pulling the Nurgle army in, Greywater fastness could finally unleash their cannons, and unleash them they did. And while that little, link between these two stories is admittedly an educated conjecture, what happened next is fact. The sheer, unbridled intensity of cannon and gunfire set loose by the forces of order was mind-blowing. overlapping fire, rapid reloads, darn near limitless ammunition. They're producing it right there, and obviously it would have a limit if they spent it all, but they got a lot. You got cannons, you got rocket batteries, and mortars, all got the fire at will order. And where Greywater fastness was once nestled, in the booming and blooming life of Giran, it's now surrounded by utter desolation. So much gunfire went off that it simply deleted the land around it, for the city is now an island in a region known as the Ghoul Mere. And the reason I started this video off by talking about diplomacy was the aftermath of this. The Nurgle forces were pushed back. Yes, absolutely. Like the good guys won. That's awesome. But the land had been corrupted nonetheless. And shelling it with all this gunfire simply churned the earth rather than purifying it. And so now it's this big dead zone of rocky blast craters and uninhabitable lands, but it's also in the realm of life. And yes, victory was had that day, but at a severe cost, because not only were the natural resources immediately around Greywater fastness just obliterated, but already burdened tension with the Sylvaneth locally reached a fever pitch. These two forces of order, the cities of Sigmar and Sylvaneth, came into open conflict multiple times over things like this. There are stories in both books about how the keepers of the woods and the forest hold those lands sacred, and the expansion and the use of materials of mankind specifically, they're incompatible. From the Sylvaneth point of view, how is making a dead zone of craters and fire any better than what Nurgle was doing? Like, it's not great. You know what I mean? Like, you can understand that, okay, this guy is supposedly my ally, he's better than Nurgle in the sense that he's not a corrupting evil chaos presence, but also if you annihilate the forests anyway, what have I gained as an ally? Nothing. And so even though this whole thing started with a Nurgle force rocking up to a city, the actions of the participants set Greywater fastness on a course where diplomacy and the ability to function with its own grand alliance becomes extremely difficult. Every day in the mortal realms, decisions like this are made. We have to purge chaos at all cost. Well, that sounds great until we see what the, quote, all costs means. Because if you destroy the very thing you set out to protect, what's the point of any of it? I like this story. It's short, it lines up two huge forces, and later directly ties into some of the most fundamental lore behind Greywater fastness. Why they are the way they are, meaning the literal geographic changes that's been around there, and explain the tensions with other, order forces. And I think that's one thing I want to see more of. I want to see more tension between factions, even if they're both on the same Grand Alliance. And so one thing I wanted to tack here at the end is, if I wanted to recreate this epic battle, how would I do so? Well, some things are easy. They tell you straight up it's set in Giran. The Cities of Sigmar player should obviously take Greywater fastness. You don't have to stick exclusively to units with cannons or guns, but certainly some would be recommended to kind of get that flavor and that feel. Now on the other side, you can go kind of wild as the Nurgle player. Heck, you can go Beasts of Chaos or Slaves to Darkness as well. I wouldn't try too hard to fit a bit of every one of those sub-factions into an army. It kind of sounds like it would just be awkward. Certainly feel free to make your own Grand Alliance Chaos Force and do whatever. I just mean you still want it to be a good functional army. You're still going to be playing a game with it, so kind of keep that in mind. One thing that I would suggest, no matter what alliance you take, like what actual, faction you're sticking to, give yourself a free Gnarlmaw, because Nurgle gets a free Gnarlmaw, and you're trying to represent that army. So even if you take, a Beast of Chaos, whether you do the Nurgle stuff for the entire army or not, give yourself a Gnarlmaw to do some cool things with. And the reason I say that is because remember, they were trying to poison the land before all hell broke loose. Before the city's army walks up, they're already poisoning the land with Gnarlmaws and toxins and that kind of thing. So let's talk about playing this out. So if I wanted to recreate this scene on the tabletop, how would I do it? The forces are fairly straightforward when we went those before, but what about the table and the battle plan? Well, if one of you is a Nurgle player, which hopefully you are, check out the battle plan located inside your battle tome. It's called Seeds of Corruption, and it's awesome. Basically, the defender, the non-Nurgle force, has most of the table, and there are 3 points on the map where the Maggotkin of Nurgle player needs to summon feculent Gnarlmaws, and whether he can or cannot is how the battle is determined. And I like it because it's simple, it's right there, you know, it's printed in the book, ready to go. It fits right into the narrative, I think somewhat almost unintentionally, right? You got the Nurgle forces trying to push to poison the land, the defender coming out to shut down that poisoning, which seems to be the exact point at which all hell breaks loose in this story, when those two forces actually meet. Now, you can, of course, always go to the older GHBs, go to the open war generator stuff, and build this mission piece by piece. And you're going to see some of the other videos that I've done in this format as far as taking specific stories and bringing them to the tabletop. I did just that. But for this one, I truly feel like the Battle Tome mission is the core crux of what you're trying to replicate, where Nurgle's poisoning the ground, that's his thing, and then the defender, who it's his land that's being poisoned, is trying to stop him. Like, that is literally exactly what's happening. And so I think it's a fantastic mission. So I kind of paused when I was doing the open war stuff, and I was like, why? They already have a better one in the book. Let's just go with that. Be sure to theme your table and terrain as if they were whatever you envision that marsh to be like just outside the city before it was totally corrupted and blown to heck. So, you know what I mean? Could be open fields, could be forest, whatever you want to do. Just make sure there's some measure of try going into, like, we're just outside of a city. And friends, those are my thoughts on the fastness beset, as talking about the armies, the factions involved, and why they matter. And this is a pivotal moment for the Greywater fastness. All these cities have moments where they've had to step up and like I said before, draw a line in the sand. We're not going anywhere. This was their moment to do that, and they did it against a combined Nurgle army that sounds awesome. If you have a lore blurb that you want me to talk about in this style from your battle tome, let me know in the comments down below what the name of that story is. Like, this story was called The Fastness Beset. Let me know in the comments down below and which battle tome it's in, and we'll get around to it. Thank you all so much. Again, please leave me feedback for this. I crank these videos out in bulk, and so next week I'll be able to take that feedback and go forward with it. So thank you all so much for listening and watching. Happy wargaming.